P. Masters, welcome to Jersey.
Thank you so much, Julian. It's great to be here with you.
It's great to have you, and it's also like, it's always a little intimidating when everyone refers to somebody by their full name with the middle initial.
Yeah.
It's always like when people have been asking for me to bring you on, it's never like, bring on Mike Masters. It's
Right.
bring on Michael P. Masters.
Yeah.
I'm like, ooh.
It's funny, I played with a guy, I played keys with him, and he'd always introduce me as Michael Paul Masters, and I'd be like, man, I wish I had 3 names. How do I have 3 names? I didn't do this to myself, you know?
Hey, it makes you a very serious guy. So.
I guess, yeah. I mean, I did write it out. There was another Michael Masters when I started being a public figure of sorts, and he was some banker or something, so I was like, well, if I had the Paul, then at least, easier to find. It's a search engine thing, yeah.
Absolutely. But you have posited a very, very fascinating theory that is often discussed within ufology these days, and you're kind of at the forefront of it, which is the extra-tempestral model, essentially.
Yeah.
So
nailed the pronunciation, by the way.
I did.
People don't always do that, but that was perfect.
I'm so glad because I was saying it in the mirror this morning. I was like, extra-tempestral.
I know, and I was trying to do something good, I thought. Totally backfired. Where I wanted to keep the extra and the estrial, and just take out ter, which means earth, add temp, which means time. And then I thought it would be easy and flowy and everybody would know what it means, and it didn't work at all.
So you had, like, the intentions were good.
The intentions were great.
There.
Yeah,
right.
yeah. Latin was spot on, take out earth, put in time, outside of time. Failed miserably.
Well, in Jersey, we'll just call them fucking future humans.
I like it.
How's that?
That's what I should have gone with to start with, man. Yeah.
All right.
Where were you 5 years ago? That would have been useful.
Yeah. Stick with me. I'll brand it for you.
Yeah, appreciate that.
But your realm, the way you got into this is very fascinating because you're not just like someone who's researched UFOs forever and stuff, which I've talked with very interesting guys in the space with that, but you are quite literally a biological anthropologist. Mm-hmm. So you're a serious dude. You studied this in college, and you were just telling me off air that you actually got into anthropology because you were interested in UFOs and aliens?
Yeah, I know. It's kind of weird, and it seemed weirder when you asked me if I knew any other people that had done it in that direction. But yeah, no, it started when I was 8 or 9 years old and had this question pop in my head. It was actually a really sort of formative moment. I talk about it at the beginning of both of my first 2 books, just so people have the origin story, because it's kind of the question I get asked the most. How'd you get into this? How does an anthropologist get interested in UFOs? But like you mentioned, it was the opposite. I was interested in UFOs because of this moment where I walked into the living room and Whitley Strieber's book was facing out, Communion, the classic 1987 book about his experience. And it had this sort of like light and a different kind of awareness, sort of a weird meditative state of sorts, and then this image pop in my head of an early hominin, chimpanzee-like form, modern human, and then the quintessential alien on the cover of the book. And with that, the question, could they be us? Could we be related? Could this form be our future selves coming back through time to study their past? And like I was 8, 9 years old at the time, so that idea, did it come from me? Did it come from somewhere else? Regardless of its origins, it put me on this path to try to understand if they could be us, being aware of selection bias, confirmation bias, all the things that could come with trying to research a question with that in mind. But one of the best things about science is that it forces you to check all of those things, and it forces you to have an open mind to other possibilities, but to still gather all the data you need to address something like that.
Yeah, and do you think that being such a young age like that, you kind of have that childlike wonder, obviously, where things aren't necessarily yet all answered for you? You're asking what?
That's a damn good question. Yeah, you're right, because, rolling with the whole confirmation bias, selection bias thing, like a lot of people impose that on me now. Like, oh, you're the future human guy. You must think that's the whole explanation. I'm like, fuck no, I don't. I've said it a million times, but I still get accused of that. It's like, I still have a very open mind to all these possibilities. And I definitely don't think this explains all of the phenomenon. I think it does check a lot of boxes, and it should be taken seriously. It should be on the table with other explanations, but I don't think it accounts for all of the variation in the beings and the craft. There's too much going on.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's a great point, is that maybe at a young age, a very malleable mind. It's interesting that it happened around that age too, because So many people seemingly are abducted beginning around age 8 or 9.
Really?
A lot of people have sort of some transformational experience. It's also, interestingly, I believe, the time that you can enter communion in the Catholic Church, or
8.
yeah. So it's like, and that's supposed to be the time that you have agency. You have the will to look at things and ask questions, understand things in a broader perspective, as opposed to just, we're going to tell you that it's this God and forget everything else. So I think it's maybe not a coincidence that that's when this happened to me too.
Did you have any like religious background as a kid?
Yeah,
as
big
well?
time. So I was raised, initially Methodist. And then he probably wouldn't like me talking about this, but we got a female pastor, and that was not okay. So we went to a Church of Christ, which was more fundamentalist, kind of conservative.
Oh, God.
Yeah, it was my first taste of misogyny in this society we live in. But no, it was, yeah. And then it got darker from there. Not darker, just a lot more conservative and like, women's places in the kitchen, and
Oh.
black people were a separate creation of God. Like, I'm not saying this was the belief in my household per se.
But that's what the pastor was telling you.
Well, that's what a lot of the people in the congregation and in that particular denomination believed. And yeah,
Wow.
some of that did come through. I did hear stuff like that as a kid. But yeah, but I don't know. I guess it didn't necessarily play into this. This was more of a question that was outside of any sort of religious belief system, and it was just an idea, sort of accompanied with a feeling that was strong enough to lead me into this area of study, and to initially study physics and astronomy, and then to switch to biological anthropology, because I realized that this question of the beings and our evolution is sort of the origins of that moment,
Yeah.
and also potentially something that isn't going to be as studied, and that turned out to be accurate. There are people looking at the craft. There are people advocating that these may be time machines, but there aren't a lot of people focusing on our evolutionary trajectory and what may indicate that they are us based on those long-term evolutionary trends.
Quick question to go back to the religion, though. Minus the cultural brainwashing, I guess, like some of those things that they were trying to beat into you that you just mentioned. When you look at the core part of like being in the Christian faith and, reviewing the Bible and stuff like that, you're going through this as a child where simultaneously at 8 or 9, you have your first kind of like, oh my God, did we come from something else here? What's up, guys? If you haven't already, please smash that subscribe button and hit that like button on the video. And if you don't have time to watch this episode right now, I'd really appreciate it if you saved it to your watch later playlist on YouTube. Finally, if you'd like to follow me on Instagram or X, those links are in my description below. Did you struggle with the idea of like what you thought of vis-a-vis, say, future human alien side versus what religion said there was God out there? Was there a clash of those two beliefs for you, or did you lean all one way?
Yeah, that's a great question. No, not for me personally, but within the question of religion in my household, there was tremendously. For instance, just to make sure, because what initially got me interested in this, or I guess maybe coincidentally or synchronistically, right before I had that experience with Whitley's book, I'd overheard my dad talking about a UFO encounter that he had had in the Amish country of Northeast Ohio, where I grew up. He was a veterinarian. He crested this hill. He had a colleague with him. It was like 2 a.m. We used to have to go out on these late night calls, and this guy was training or something. I don't know why he was with him, because it's not very common for him to have somebody with him. But he described this glowing ball of light, which in Amish country is weird because there's not a lot of lights for obvious reasons. But this thing was about 200 meters away, just kind of hovering on the horizon, shot toward them, hovered above their truck for, 10, 15 seconds, went back to where it was, and then shot up at tremendous speed. So there's a lot of variables there that would indicate that this is not a prosaic type of thing. So I heard him explaining this, and it sort of piqued my interest. But then to make sure I had the details of the story right, because like I said, I've been on this sort of journey since I was a young child. In college, I think it was my freshman year, I interviewed him about it. And he told the story exactly the same. All the details were the same, but then came the religious interpretation. This is the devil leading you away from God. This is not something we should be talking about. It's evil, it's demonic, and it's going to, lead you down this path that's away from God and is therefore problematic. And then I also found that extends to the broader community, where a lot of people that are in the Christian camp are not a big fan of the extraterrestrial idea or UFOs and aliens, because that's implicit in it for a lot of people, because that's been the dominant mantra for so long, because they believe there's one creation of God here on Earth. Full stop. So because of that, aliens on a different planet doesn't fit with their preconceived notions of the biblical creation story, and therefore is something else, and we shouldn't talk about it. So in my second book, I was like, hey, y'all, this is still the same creation. This is still God's creation here on this planet, just future God's creations coming back to hang out with past God's creations. So this extra-tempestral idea should be, well loved within the Christian community, because it still fits within that worldview. It doesn't bring in an outside creation, but it's just different children of God interacting through time.
Got it. So let's go ahead.
That hasn't worked.
What?
That hasn't necessarily worked. That appealed to them for that extra-tempestral thing to just...
To who? Wait, you lost me.
The Christians.
Oh,
I thought if I said that, they'd be like, oh, yeah, cool, man. No, that hasn't. That's all I was trying to say. It was a swing and a miss, to say the least. Maybe it resonated with a couple people, but I think they still just ignored the question. So that's all I was trying to point out.
I think it's always difficult. We talk about religion and we talk about belief systems, and I'd say there's religion in many things these days. People find religion in politics. Once people form a core belief that they kind of stake their meaning to, the idea that even 1% of it could be not what they thought it was is something that is foreign to them. They're like, no, that's not possible. Yeah. And I think that the people who have the most peace, from who I've spoken with over the years who are religious, are those who are kind of resigned to the themes and the goodness, but not necessarily all the quote unquote facts that are thrown.
Yeah. Well, I think we are coming to a head, and this has come up a couple of times. I was in a meeting with one of the congressmen involved in this UAP task force, and his chief of staff and some other colleagues of mine, and just a small little meeting to talk about some of these things. One thing that came up, I think that hearing's today, by the way. I think it's happening like right now. Yeah. Sorry, am I not allowed to talk about when things are happening?
No, you can.
Okay, cool.
I'm gonna put this out in like a month.
Okay. Anyway, so we're talking about like how they wanted to know what we thought this hearing should be like, or how it should go, or what types of things should be addressed. And the question of religion came up because it's obviously a dominant thing in our society. And I was saying, and my colleagues as well who study this more than I do, my last book was about this question, but they're like theologists and psychologists who study belief systems. But it seems like to start, there's different baselines we have to build before we can get to this overarching question of religion and how it may relate to the UFO phenomenon throughout antiquity. But it seems like we need to start with, is this real? And I think we've been working at that since 2017, New York Times article, yada, yada. And then the DOD acknowledging the reality of these craft, Fravor and Graves talking about what they saw in Dietrich too. And then once we've established that this is real, then we can start getting into theory a little bit, which is why I've been coming into the conversation more recently, because that's kind of the only thing I can contribute is this theoretical approach, bringing in knowledge from these different academic fields to try to build a case for this extra-tempestral model, but also others. How do they fit with each other? And then we can establish a framework in theory, and then we can get into implications. What are the implications of this if it's real, and if they are coming from outer space, or they're coming from our future, or they're coming through dimensions, or they're living underground, cryptoterrestrials? Then we can start to look at implications of this. We can start to potentially understand their intent through looking at patterns. And then that's where this issue of religion comes in. Maybe a lot of these things that we do believe in a literal biblical sense did happen, but they didn't fit within the box of people at that time. So they created these ideas around them and try to explain them the best way they could. And we're still trying to do that today. We're still trying to fit the reality of this phenomenon into the framework of religious belief systems. It doesn't neatly fit, so a lot of people say, "F that. I don't want to have anything to do with it." Other people are like, well, this must be demons. It must be demonic, like my dad. He's like, well, this is a thing, but he probably only believes it because he saw it. This is a thing, but it's this. It's this thing that I already understand, so I can put it in this smaller box within the bigger box. So he does bring the box in, but I think it's going to come to the point where the two boxes are one. Where this UFO phenomenon, kind of your original question, I guess, was how did they fit together for me? I think we're all going to be at that point where the UFO phenomenon, and historically and prehistorically, and then our belief systems are going to merge into one thing. And that was kind of what I was trying to do with this last book, is show how those are likely to come together.
Yeah. Now maybe it would be helpful just for everyone out there to follow along to break down, like you've obviously gone through some of it today, but to break down once and for all the extra-tempestral model and what exactly it means and how the time travel could work, if you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah, absolutely. That's always a great place to start because, yeah, like I was listening to this book about the Akashic Record recently, and it was like the third chapter where she finally defined what she meant by the Akashic Record. I'm like, that really would have helped in chapter 1 because I had no idea what the hell you're talking about. So yeah, that's a great place to start. So the idea, as we sort of touched on previously, is just that we have had a long evolutionary history on this planet. We've evolved culturally, we've evolved physiologically, and if those same dominant trends continue into the future, we're likely to look like morphologically, and we're likely to have technology similar to what we see in these beings that are showing up now throughout recent history, throughout the prehistoric past, arguably. So what I mostly focused on and what my PhD research was in is craniofacial evolutionary anatomy.
Craniofacial evolutionary anatomy.
Yeah, so I mentioned these dominant trends. The most dominant ones are an increase in brain size, what we call encephalization, but also a change in the shape of the brain. So it got about 3 times larger compared to a chimpanzee or our earliest hominin ancestors. The ones people are most familiar with are actually about halfway through the Australopithecines, like Lucy, but you can go back another 3 million years before that. But throughout most of that time, we were really just evolving our postcranial anatomy, neck down, standing upright. How are we adapting to this new form of locomotion? Bipedalism, the trait that actually defines the hominin lineage. But after about the time of the Australopithecines, beginning with Homo habilis, about 2.5 million years ago, then we see the brain start to increase in size. It moves out over the eyes, and it increases mediolaterally.
Homo habilis, I'm not remembering that one. Where was the origin there?
So you've got the Australopithecines.
Yep.
So the gracile forms became us, the robust forms died out. So you have Australopithecus afarensis, africanus, and anamensis. And then they eventually, one of them or some of them, eventually evolved into Homo habilis. They were the first to make and use stone tools, which is why we call them that. It means handyman. Which was a really important innovation that allowed our brains to get bigger. It actually contributed to our brains getting bigger because there's this feedback loop. And our culture, our new abilities allowed our brains to get bigger. For instance, cutting meat with stone tools. We invented fire not long after that. So cooking our food allowed a reduction in our masticatory musculature. So the face could get smaller and get out of the way of the brain. And then the teeth got smaller, the chewing muscles got smaller, brains started to get bigger, and then the feedback loop comes because we think of new ways to solve problems and new ways to process our food, new ways to use fire. And so you can see the beginning of this sort of self-licking ice cream cone, this runaway brain train, as we call it, where our innovation drives new tools. Our new tools allow the brain to get bigger, and it continued like that and accelerated, beginning with Homo erectus, about 1.5 million years ago. Our brain just really started to take off, move forward, like I mentioned, but also expand mediolaterally. It got bigger from left to right, especially in the parietal lobes.
And what did we add? Like, what segments of the brain did we add there?
Those are involved with motor functions. The frontal lobe especially is involved with higher level thinking, problem solving. It's sort of the thing that makes us more unique relative to other animals, relative to the great apes too, because they have large brains for their body size, but they're not doing the same stuff we are. But a lot of it was a shape change, it was a size change, but importantly, it also changed the shape of our face, the size of it. So I guess I could break this down. A common example I use with dogs, you can think of a Doberman Pinscher versus a Pug or a Chihuahua, where the Doberman's got a long snout, really low sloping forehead, and then you shrink back the face, you add a forehead, and now you're looking at a Chihuahua or a Doberman or a Rottweiler, any sort of animal with that bowel plan. And you can see it across the animal kingdom. I use dogs because we did it to them in a relatively short period of time. So it's also familiar to us. People know dogs better than they know past hominin ancestors. So it's, if I rattle off like all of these Latin names, it doesn't really make any difference. And the whole point of educating and teaching is to speak to people in a way they understand. Otherwise, you're just fulfilling your own egotistical dreams of saying things that people don't get, which kind of defeats the purpose. So if we think about the dogs, that's the main trend. Faces got small, heads got bigger, expanded out. And if you fast forward that, we would look very similar to these archetypal gray aliens with the big round heads, what we call neurocranial globularity, and especially with the enlarged parietal lobes. I mentioned that those are the area where we see the largest change in both size and shape. And then also larger eyes, kind of the wraparound eyes, and the more reduced and retracted face, pointy chin.
Why would the eyes be bigger?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of my first academic papers after grad school was in a journal called Medical Hypotheses, where I laid out this theory about how these trends are likely to affect vision in a functional sense. So I was particularly looking at juvenile onset myopia, which affects a huge number of people throughout the world, but especially individuals in Eastern Asia, Southeast Asia, China, Korea, all over the place. Upwards of 80 to 90% of people have nearsightedness. And it's, not a huge issue today. And in this paper, I cited other people and also sort of added my own interpretation where you can see how that would happen, where you have the brain impinging itself on the eye, the face shrinking underneath it. And what you see in the myopic eye, if you imagine squishing a tennis ball from top to bottom, it squeezes out on the side. That's exactly what the myopic eye looks like. The reason we are nearsighted is because it changes the focal length from that extension of the eye out of the orbit, and it focuses light in front of the retina as opposed to on the retina, like it would in a perfectly spherical eye. That's exactly what we expect to see as the brain grows out over it, the face shrinks back, that it would sort of circumscribe the orbit and create that distortion to the eye. So to answer your question, in this paper, I cited some other researchers that have demonstrated that the eye and the brain have a pleiotropic gene relationship, which means that when we see two different organs, we see the brain and the eye as two separate things. They're actually controlled by the same set of genes. So they're essentially
Same
one
set of
thing.
genes?
Yeah. So pleiotropy just means you have different characteristics that are influenced by the same gene or set of genes. So therefore, they have the same growth and development. They have the same, in an evolutionary phylogenetic sense, they change over time together, evolutionarily and throughout growth and development. And the other thing is that the eye grows out of the brain. It grows out of the telencephalon during fetal ontogeny, which is a bunch of big words that just mean it goes boop, and it comes out of that developing brain.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, so they are essentially the same organ. So if the brain gets bigger, we would expect that the eye would get bigger too, to answer your question. So we see them as two different things, but essentially they're one organ. So an increase in one we'd expect to see an increase in the other. Unfortunately, we can't study the eye because it's soft tissue. It decomposes, it goes away. We can study the orbit, but there's also a lot of other things in the orbit. There's rectus muscles, there's fat. But we can get a sense of those changes over time with regard to brain, eye. We can see the orbit changing. We can see how that shifts. And it was even 30,000 years ago with some ancestors and the Cro-Magnon people, a lot of your listeners have probably heard of them. They had these sort of low square orbits, and then we started to get more increase superior-inferiorly, top to bottom. getting into the weeds a little too much here. Probably just lost a couple of your
No,
listeners.
not
But
at all. It's very interesting.
beyond that, there's just a number of other things too. Our bodies have changed. We've sort of gotten smaller. There's been a decrease in robusticity over the last 30,000 years.
We have?
Yeah. Yeah. And
Has that, a quick question, I'm sorry, because like we get lost in timelines where when you think 10 years ago, you can relate to it, right? And then you think 50 years ago, you can't relate to it. 100 years, it's almost like time gets exponential in how we appreciate it, if you understand what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
So if I look at something that objectively compared to the history of the earth is not long ago, but for me is a long time ago, which would be 150 years ago. I don't have the numbers on me offhand, but I know like human beings were smaller in height and weight on average at that time. So are we saying that the weight has changed, the height and weight has changed down over time, but it's not necessarily linear? Sometimes it goes a little lower and then comes back up higher?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, and you framed it perfectly too, because we see both. We do see an increase and decrease in height evolutionarily, because when we're talking about these Australopithecines, they're about 3.5 feet tall, really diminutive, tiny creatures that got preyed on by all kinds of different animals. And then we started to get larger. We have this fossil called KNMWT 15,000. It was a Homo erectus. You don't need to know all that. That doesn't matter.
15,000.
That's just its catalog number. That's if you wanted to find it in the museum, Kenya National Museum, it was found in West Turkana. It's the 15.
It sounds like a Bond villain's weapon, but
It would be a cool band name too.
Yeah.
I mean, nobody would ever come see because they couldn't remember it.
Nope.
But it's almost as bad as Extra-Tempestral, for God's sakes. But no, that's the catalog number. But it was a Homo erectus from 1.5 million years ago, and this dude was big. Like he was only 11 years old when he died. It's thought he died from a cavity, and it created an infection.
Oh, wow.
And we can cure these things now pretty easily, but they didn't have dental medicine 1.5 million years ago. So homeboy died at 11 years old. And so we can project what he would have looked like if he got to be to a mature age, and he would have been about 6'1". Strong body build. The post-cranial morphology is almost identical to ours. There's differences. It's more similar to a Neanderthal of sorts.
I'm sorry to get into the weeds, but can you explain how it's more similar to a Neanderthal?
Just because of the robusticity. Because Neanderthals were like hefty. Their bones were big. They were built for a cold environment. Even though this individual, Turkana boy, as he's known, which is way easier than KNMWT 15,000, even though he was 11, he was still beefy, stocky, So but that 6'1" height, if that's an accurate projection, indicates we're already within and above the range of modern humans. I think the average today for males is about 5'9" or 5'10" or something, depending on what part of the world you're in. With that said, there is vacillation, what we call diachronic changes too. And that's one thing that one of my first research projects at Ohio University was to study people's occupations and changes over about 100-year period. And there's massive change. You look at the Depression, people got a lot shorter. Come out of the Depression, there's a boom time, people get taller.
What?
And you can see it within this. Yeah, there's a guy named, I think Richard Steckel is his name at Ohio State, who did way more research on this than we did. We cited him a lot, but we were also contributing to it. And yeah, it's crazy. Like it happens fast. When we go through a depression or a recession and people are cutting back on nutrient intake, I mean, that's affecting their children instantly.
Whoa.
And then those kids grow up and they're shorter. So there's diachronic change. There's also evolutionary change. But with regard to future humans, some are described as short grays, whether those are our descendants or avatars or sort of biological droids. It's hard to say 'cause some don't have genitalia, kind of need genitalia to make more babies, unless something's making you. And I kind of think that's the case with these ones. The sort
Something's making you?
Yeah, the dickless ones are probably made by a future human who no longer is making robots. Like it ain't Elon Musk making something that needs oiled and breaks down mechanically all the time. But it's probably the extension of our gene engineering into the future, where you just create something that can do all of this stuff for you. Send them in first to get somebody. If you're abducting an individual and they're a big scary person, send them in first, and they're more expendable because there's something you created for this purpose. And if you look at Whitley Strieber's account, he sort of describes these small beings as the muscle behind the operation.
For people out there who haven't seen Danny Jones' podcast with Whitley, which was a great episode,
Yeah,
can you just
absolutely.
explain, you've mentioned him a couple times today, can you just explain who he is and what his experience was?
Yeah, phenomenal individual. Brief summary, he had a cabin in upstate New York, had some strange experiences with people at his house. So there were other witnesses, lights would come on. I thought his roof was on fire. And then we went to investigate, and light turns off. Not long after that, he had a shotgun by his bed, armed the whole house with an alarm system because he was freaked out. Like he knew something was happening. And then when he was first taken, he sat up in bed and he sees this small creature, like what I was talking about, sort of the big head, small face, but wearing a kind of armor. And it runs toward him, and all of a sudden he's asleep. And then he ends up outside. He's interestingly sitting in a little beam of light. There's snow all around, but there's no snow where they're sitting. And it's cold, but it's not as cold as it would be, outside in this situation. But there he starts to see other types as well. He's always with the muscle of the operation, as he describes it. But as he ascends into the ship, he starts to encounter a woman, a female presence. And what's interesting is in these cases, even when these beings are seemingly so different from us, we can still sense kind of their soul or their personality. Something like a gender almost transcends the physical form to some extent. But he's in contact with this woman, and then he goes on to have a lot of other experiences, even had sex with her once, that he writes about in a different book that he co-authored with Jeffrey Kripal called The Supernatural, I think it is. Mm-hmm. But importantly, he sees different forms, 4 different types on the ship. And that's a really common thing across various experiencer accounts, is that there are different forms oftentimes working together, sometimes even with people, just normal everyday people in military garb, like Air Force uniforms, basically.
So he's seeing things that range from literally human-looking to grays to mantids or stuff like that?
I don't know if he ever described anything like that. Some of them he described as looking oriental, that they had eyes, face, everything just like ours. But essentially, I think he said they were slanted. So they looked like ours, but a little bit more oriental, or what we'd say East Asian looking. And then, the woman, the taller woman, to get back to height, she was taller, had gray alien type characteristics, but was in charge of the operation. She had higher consciousness, telepathy. But then there were these ones that he called the muscle of the operation too, that were, I've come to think, possibly manufactured. And this is, obviously we can't know until we have them, and maybe we do have them, and maybe that's a part of these crash retrievals, that we could go look at them and study them and see if there is a difference between ones that are reproducing themselves and ones that are created in the image of those in our future, if they are future humans, who are making them to perform various tasks. And I would love to do that.
Yeah. Let's put a pin in that, because I do want to come to UFO crash retrievals later, but I want to stay with some of the experiencer stuff. So you had said, I think it was in your Extra-Tempestral book, you had said something in the range of like 90% or something like that of people who report being abducted claim it was a positive experience.
Yeah, I mean, there's some qualifiers to that.
How so?
Well, first off, what you're referencing is the Dr. Edgar Mitchell Free Study. It's a survey of experiencers. So. Yeah. At the time they published that in 2019, they had 3,500 individuals. And I always try to acknowledge problems with methodologies, and there are issues with surveys. People can lie, they can distort the truth. Sometimes they don't understand what is the truth. These are people who are willing to talk. Some people are less willing to talk. So there could be inherent biases in those two. 3,500 is a decent sample size. It's the largest for something like this. But there are, they have added, I think they're up above 5,000 now, because they're continuing this study. It's also important to talk about the sample. This is a multilingual international sample. It's not just a group of, dudes from Omaha or something. Like, it's a pretty broad sample of individuals. So we can glean something from that. So individuals, importantly, and one of the main reasons I reference this study is to talk about the types, like what we're talking about right now. And the majority that are seen are described as human.
Looking. Yeah.
No, human.
Literally human.
Yeah. Not even human looking. And this was something I sort of, I screwed this up in my first book, going to my second book, because I really just focused on the grays. And I didn't show just how much variation there was, or I was mostly just talking about how could we get there? What are some of the forces in our evolutionary past that would lead us to look like this? And obviously, it'd be easy to say we live in space, we live underground, it's dark, that's why our eyes get bigger. Maybe, I don't know. But I try to stay away from speculating about those things and just focus on dominant trends that we can understand. But in this study, the top reported type was human. And then after that was the short grays that we were discussing, tall grays, and then hybrids. And what I always
What are
point
the
out,
hybrids again? I'm sorry.
just a combination of the two forms.
Okay.
So like one example is Travis Walton, when he was taken, most likely an ambulance call because he was shocked by this craft. He wakes up in this bed with two short grays around him.
Yeah.
Didn't have a chance to check in their pants. It'd be really interesting to know if they had genitalia or not, because it might help answer this question: are they all droids if we see the short grays, or are they just creating them in their image like we do with robots now? But then he escaped. He went in the control room. He's pushing buttons. They're like, "No, bro, don't do that because you're going to crash our ship." And then he was approached by a man who looks just like a man, tall, blonde hair, blue eyes, stocky build, and then encountered other women and men who he said had sort of a familial connection, like they all kind of looked the same. So that would be an example of what we consider the hybrids, ones with sort of the archetypal gray alien form, but also a human form.
Right.
And we can come back to that too, like that hybridization program is kind of an important aspect of all of this. But
I'm sorry, Michael, I just, there's so many things here, I don't want to get lost in them, but from a detail perspective, like, how can we explain seeing in the same place literally human looking, and grays, if based, and maybe I misunderstood this, but based on what you were saying earlier about over time and things changing, that would suggest that those two beings are from very different future realms, meaning one, I'm just throwing random numbers out, one could be 200 years from now, another could be 200,000 years from now.
Yeah, exactly. And I coined a term for that, temporal ancestry. So we talk about geographic ancestry now, where we have people from sub-Saharan Africa that have sort of lighter body builds, darker skins. They've evolved to the climate and the UVA light in that area, and evolved more melanin because of that. People from East Africa, or East Asia rather, Native Americans. So we can see snapshots of our evolutionary history now in this present time.
Yes.
In these cases of close contact where they see different forms with marked differences in their morphology, I think it's exactly that, like what you just said, that it's people coming back from different times or working together from different times for likely different purposes. They may have a variable reasons for wanting to come back and collect data on the human past, but they're likely all doing it at the same time to be less intrusive, to disrupt us and our timeline to a lesser extent. But what I always point out is based on the study. So you've got the humanoid, human-looking, human form, short grays, tall grays, hybrids. Every single one of those is an upright walking biped. That's the trait that defines our lineage. We are bipedal. And I've said 100 times that if what's getting out of these ships is some kind of squid or octopus or spider-looking creature, I never would have given two shits about this because there's no connection to us. But that trait alone, and you could go past that. You could talk about the tetrapod characteristics, having 4 limbs, which goes back 400 million years on this planet.
400 million.
400 million. We share that with them. Pentadactyly having 5 digits at the end of each limb, and there's some variation there. Some say they see 4, but for the most part, they have 5.
How do we know it's 400 million? That's so long ago.
The fossil record. We can see when that 4-limb characteristic started. And then Darwin actually pointed out back in the mid-1800s that it makes no damn sense. Like, you use the same 4 limbs to do all of these different things. Whales got them, and bats got them, and we and horses and cows and all these ungulates. But it would make more sense if we just developed, if an elephant had 8 limbs instead of 4. But we take the same 4-limb bow plan from 400 million years ago and just modify it for our purposes. That shows that we evolved together. We share common ancestry, as we say. That's a synapomorphy, or a shared derived characteristic of all mammals, that we are tetrapods. So, importantly, all walking upright, all bipedal, therefore, we would classify them all as hominin. If we are reproducing with them, that's where the hybrid part comes in. Based on the biological classification of species concept, we're the same fucking species. You can't reproduce with something that you don't share the requisite genes with in order to make an offspring. And so there's a lot that indicates that they are us just from that alone. And that's, speaking of terminology, like the extraterrestrial thing, I also hate the NHI thing that we've developed, non-human intelligence.
Oh, right.
And it's meant to get away from extraterrestrial. It's meant to get away from alien. It's meant
Why
to
do you say
have
that?
a more general term, because extraterrestrial pigeonholes the conversation. And I used to hate that term because it was like, oh, they must be from outer space. And you do still hear people say that, but to a lesser extent than they do now, because everybody switched to NHI, which is great because it doesn't say extraterrestrial, but it also implicitly implies that they're not human. It's in the damn term. They even used that in the Dr. Edgar Mitchell study. They said, when you're on the ship, did you have contact with a non-human intelligence? First answer is human.
Do you
So
think
even
that-
with that bias in the question, they still said they were human.
Do you think that there's potentially a purposeful reason for that?
I do. Yeah. I do think that it allows them to tell the truth, that there's no evidence of a non-human intelligence. There's no evidence of extraterrestrials. I think they even did that in the Arrow report. I think they used that exact terminology. And a lot of people are writing me like, bro, did you read this? The way they phrased it,
It's not a lie.
It's not a lie, They might be telling the truth, but damn, that's a subtle little lie, or a subtle little way of telling the truth and allowing the potential reality of this to still exist. Yeah. No, I think, I mean, it's hard to say what the intent of these people is, and there's probably a lot of different people, different intentions working on this, but yeah, that's a very intuitive observation you had there, because it could have been a lexicon thing to leave the door open.
I want to go back to that example I gave a few minutes ago, just to keep it simple, to stay with it, where I talked about the humans that are maybe from 200 years from now, or 2,000 years from now, whatever I said, and then the Greys that might be from 200,000 years from now, and they're both working together. My question here is, doesn't that technically make us present humans, and maybe even past humans, the people drawing the short end of the stick? Because like they're all in on it together, but we're not. And if so, why do you think that determination's made? Or let's throw another one in there.
Yeah.
Are there potentially people who exist right now or have existed in the past century who are taking part in this stuff that have ever been reported?
Well, I think there are, absolutely. And I do think when people talk about seeing very modern humans in very modern military uniforms, that it is us. And it probably has been us for a while. And if you would have asked me this 5 years ago, I'd have been like, I don't know, that sounds a little crazy. It's a little conspiracy theory-ish.
We're already down that rabbit hole, my friend.
Yeah, probably been down there for a while. It's starting to get low on oxygen down here. I don't know how deep we went. But then you have people like Grush coming out saying, oh, actually, we have been doing this for a while. If we're reverse engineering these things, if we're in contact with the people creating them, hypothetically, if they are from our future, then yeah, and what he talks about with the contracts that may have been made and meetings that may have happened, and they're allowed to take us and sample our genetic material for their purposes. It really makes you wonder what the level of interaction is. And then when you have experiencers who are also describing seeing these people in the same types of uniform we see military members walking in now, you got to wonder if people are working with them.
So it could be.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you think that if people, let's just keep it in one place, if people in the Pentagon were aware that maybe it's what you say and it's future humans, do you think that is part of the reason we see some of the similarities there as we do actually with your father, with his experience, where there's like the Collins elite in the Pentagon who's saying, oh, this is future humans, so, they're fucking with the occult or something like that, and that goes against my biblical beliefs, so therefore we shouldn't look at it?
Maybe. Yeah, I don't know. I think the people that are trying to put the UFO question in a religious box likely don't know who they are. That's just my guess. Because I think there's a lot, if you know what it is, why would you have to try to cram this thing into your box of worldviews? I think it would be easier to just open the box.
Yeah.
And I think that's a big part of this phenomenon as a whole, is that we're all supposed to look at it, take it seriously, and widen our aperture to be able to include things that are more mysterious than what we thought was conventionally real or allowed or possible. And I think it's kind of been an aspect of the phenomenon the entire time. Now, potentially more than ever, because we have the possibility that this will be acknowledged as real on a mass scale. But I think if we look back through time, and even in these historical, biblical, religious accounts, they're seemingly, the classic overused example is Ezekiel, but it's overused because it has a lot of elements of a real UFO encounter, very similar today. They had a different way of understanding reality back then. We could talk about wheels within wheels and burning embers and voices booming into their heads. Like now we would say telepathy, counter-rotating flywheels to add stability, and the electromagnetic force to add anti-gravity capabilities, lights on the outside. These are all conventionally understood terms. Now, back then they weren't. So they created this story, and that story got put into a book, and then,
Can you explain that, the Ezekiel account there?
Yeah, so it was basically what I just mentioned. He described it as humanoid form sitting on a throne, a dome above their head, a wheel within a wheel, so some sort of rotation and burning embers, and then there's apparently some sort of telepathic communication that took place. What's funny is I just did a shoot for a documentary last week, and the guy who was filming it read the original description of Ezekiel before all of the translations. His dad was super into this and really was interested in a lot like what Diana Pasulka is doing with going back to the original versions of things. But his dad had done this same thing, and his son, who I met, Jesse, who was doing this shoot, had read these and said, bro, there's way more detail. Like, this was a fucking UFO sighting. And we get the boiled down version. It's like playing telephone through time. We have this version in the King James Bible or whatever. But I guess the original one was way more descriptive. And so, yeah, I mean, if we can include that, it would seem to indicate that it's either a similar phenomenon, potentially the same phenomenon, appearing in different times throughout the past. And going to the future, we could see all of the variation potentially as the different forms that are existing to carry out these missions in the past, occasionally being a little more overt in their activities, potentially to have that carrot in front of us to make us question things, to acknowledge that there's things more mysterious than what we can understand, and to widen that aperture in the same way people are trying to do now in Congress, in not so much with the Collins elite. They're kind of doing the opposite. But I think we're sort of at this culmination point where all of that carrot and sticking is leading to the place where all of the carrots are sitting in a giant pile right in front of us, and we're so close to opening the door and feasting on these delicious fruits of the mysteries of the past.
Do you think that there's also some weird, I don't know, government-y, psyop-y type thing behind this? And I have to ask that because for so long they made the UFO phenomenon this culty, like you were crazy if you talked about it topic for decades and decades and decades, dating back forever. And then suddenly, boom, 2017, you know what, Christopher Mellon, nothing to see here. Member of the Mellon family is going to walk out of the Pentagon straight into New York Times and say, legally, I'm allowed to give this to you. Here you go. You have all these people come out. I mean, I've had Lou Elizondo in here as well. It's fascinating to hear. But I wonder, even when I sit across from a guy like Lou, how much of that is like it's an intel op versus what's true?
Yeah. It's a great way to approach it, and I think we all should, because there's been disinformation for a long time. Like, you have people like Richard Doty. I don't know much about him. I can't give his backstory, but I know really fucked up this Benowitz guy and was meant to put misinformation and disinformation out. And that goes back to Project Sign, Grudge, Blue Book. All of them manufactured this stigma so that we wouldn't talk about it. And it was really fucking effective. Like, they did a great job with that. It's still hard to talk about today. There's still this lingering stigma. I was invited to give a couple lectures in university classes about this, and there's just an icky feeling when you first start doing it. Like, they were really good at that.
Yes.
And it lasted. There's this cultural hangover that we're, popping aspirin trying to get rid of now, because they really allowed us to think we shouldn't be talking about this. And that stigma, that shame that we feel was manufactured. It was put in place. And we're really trying to get past that now. And yeah, 2017 was a big step forward, and there's continued to be steps forward. And I think the congressional hearings, whether we get anything out of it or not, I don't think it really matters. But what's important is that we're talking about it and we're taking it seriously. New York Times article brought a lot of people out. That first congressional hearing, I started meeting all kinds of people that were in positions of society that you wouldn't expect them to really be openly talking about this, but they're like, hang on. So we have these pilots, top pilots. Well, I believe Fravor was even like the instructor. I don't know what they're called. I'm not an Air Force or Navy guy, but like a top gun pilots who know the difference between something prosaic and something weird, saying this is a weird thing and we're telling you about this. And it allowed people to take that seriously, A, because of who they were, but B, because they were under oath. They were under oath saying this is real. And it takes that for people, unfortunately, because there's so much data out there. There's so much evidence. But for so many folks, it's going to take the government being like, hey, this is real. You're allowed to think it's real now because we're the ones that told you it wasn't for 75 years. Right. And it's unfortunate because we shouldn't need that. If you have an open mind, you can study this, all of the different elements of it, and come to your own conclusion. But for so many people, and likely it's because there's so many other things to focus on, we're constantly being bombarded with stimulus. There's all these distractions. It's actually pretty negative when people don't have distractions. They only focus on the UFO phenomenon too. If you've ever been on UFO Twitter, you encounter that. But I do think there's this point where we're starting to get the stick that carries the carrot's getting shorter. And I've long thought that this move toward disclosure is not the government doing it, but the visitors themselves.
The visitors themselves.
I think they're the ones that are leading this charge toward disclosure. I don't have any evidence. It's sort of an intuitive sense I have. And from looking at all of the different aspects of what's happening and how it's been happening, I get the sense that we're reaching a point, a sort of nexus in space, time, space, where we are going to have broad awareness of this. And they said, catch up. Not wait up, catch up. So I think Congress is trying to get to a point where they're not caught with their pants down, and they've put in place some broad awareness, or at least presented the information in some capacity in a public forum, bipartisanly, which is weird as shit. Like, what else in this world right now, in this country, is bipartisan? Other than this UFO question.
Yeah,
there's a lot that seems to indicate
makes it tingle a little bit.
Yeah, I'm tingling all over right now, thinking about the fact that there could be something that unites this country. It's insane, and it's UFOs.
Yeah,
I think that's an underappreciated aspect of this. People do talk about it, but that's crazy. It's cool. So yeah, I don't know. I do get the sense that we're sort of being led. We, as in Congress in the United States, is being led to do something ahead of something that is coming.
Yeah. So, I mean, the jokes in my head go to, so Lou Elizondo's a future human, or people like this are a future human. I know it's not what you're saying.
No, not at all.
But you're saying that, like, the forces of that could be manipulating this type of situation to be spoken through people like that.
Yeah, and I don't even like the word manipulation per se, just because it does have a negative connotation, but a guiding of sorts. Historically, it was guiding away from. Now, even if they are meant to be disseminating information. I think it's less disinformation and misinformation, which was what they were doing over the last 70 years. And now it's probably just information. But it is guiding, it is changing. But then it gets into the question, well, who are they working for? Why are they doing this? I don't know. I can't speak to that. But it does seem like there's a push. And I think it's less of a push and more of a pull from the visitors themselves.
Right. My friend Jesse Michaels was actually at one of the recent hearings, and
I love Jesse.
The great guy, but so smart about this stuff, so well read on all of it. And the thing that annoyed him that makes me double take on some of this stuff is the fact that he was like, all these congressmen have no idea what they're talking about.
Yeah.
Like the most basic shit. Like they don't have a clue. So they're so easy to be, and again, I know you don't like the word, but they're so easy to be manipulated or something like that because they don't even know where to begin with it. Like, what has your experience been in like some of the private meetings with some of these guys that you've been invited into?
Yeah, so two things there. One, I do think they don't know. Most people don't. I don't know either. I mean, there's so much convoluted shit involved with this. Nobody can know all of it, but there is a certain level of awareness about the historical aspects of this phenomenon that I do think anybody has access to, and be discerning, of course, and obviously be aware that there was disinformation for a long period of time. But with that said, these Congress people were asking pretty informed questions considering how much space this takes up on their server. Very tiny amount of space considering everything else that they have to do in these jobs. I was really impressed by the level of awareness they did have relative to most people and relative to what I expected of them in those positions. But you're right. The
bar was low.
The bar was low, yeah. But I was pleasantly surprised, not just because the bar was low, but I was like, wow, they're talking about things that actually do kind of matter. And it's not like they're just trying to get information for the first time. Clearly, some of them read up before asking these questions. And that's the meeting that we just had. They wanted to have a few academics together. It was the guys I published this paper with recently about crypto-terrestrials.
Crypto-terrestrials.
Yeah. And so they came across the paper, they reached out to us, like, hey, can we have this conversation? Because we want to ask informed questions. That's great. That's trying to educate yourself ahead of something where your education can help you and the American public get better information because they took the time to learn about it first. And so that is happening. You know, and Jesse's right, like they can't know everything. And if they did, they could ask better questions. But I think they were doing okay. And hopefully with this one happening right now, they're doing even better because they had more time to think about it and they had access to information in that first hearing that they could then build on going into the second one. But, you know, more whistleblowers helps people that actually were interacting with these things. What I would love to see is them bringing the people that are actually hiding this shit in the first place, the members of the military-industrial complex who have a very good reason to keep this stuff from entering the public sphere, because of how disruptive it might be to their industries and how they're trying to protect their intellectual property and all of these ramifications. Again, that gets into implications, which comes after proving and what are they and what might they be and all of these other things. But, and likely these people would be like Dave Chappelle in that skit from the 2000s, you know, slapping the table, I'll plead the fifth. I'll plead the fifth. They're probably not going to say anything, but those are the people that should be sitting in front of Congress getting grilled right now. Because they're the ones that are hiding all of this. Why are you hiding it? What do you not want us to know?
Yeah, I think it was also Jesse when I was talking with him. He was considering what the intelligence read-in procedure was, and the thing he talked about was compartmentalization. And there was someone else I was talking about this with, but I can't remember who it was. And they said the same thing. And
stovepiping is a huge problem.
Right. So, you know, it'd be one thing if like this entire group, you know, maybe at the top of the Pentagon knew everything and knew all the secrets. But in reality, there's all these little secret teams that meet in skiffs on one topic or two topics or something that comprise, you know,
that's a
the
great
full
point.
thing comprises 10,000 things. And so you could have people who have these small little breadcrumbs where it's like, imagine if you just found a few puzzle pieces on the ground. You can't do anything with it. But if you had the full set of pieces to the puzzle, you could build the puzzle. So what can they even reveal? Yeah,
that's true. I mean, the stovepiping is certainly a huge issue regarding the way all of these things are put into different pieces that, yeah, you don't see the whole picture. That's the whole reason they do it. But yeah, that's a great extension of that it goes into trying to get information about it too, because you're asking somebody that does know something, but it's one small piece.
Guys, if you're still watching this video and you haven't yet hit that subscribe button, please take 2 seconds and go hit it right now. Thank you.
I recently mentioned to this congressperson, their chief of staff, that I know someone who is a part of that same thing, and they're ready to be a whistleblower. They want to talk about it, but you're right. How much does that contribute? It's another data point, though. It does actually help them see, oh, okay, this is happening here too, and how does it relate to this, and how does it relate to that? But still, you're not going to see the whole picture, and that's what they want. And they've done a fantastic job of keeping it that way. And yeah, kudos to them. It's impressive.
How'd that person get in touch with you?
Showed up at my office, actually. Yeah.
Why'd they pick you?
I asked them that question too. A few metaphysical reasons and a few physical reasons. But they wanted to talk to somebody about it, recognized that I could, I would take them seriously. I would listen. I would understand, and I also might know people I could put them in touch with who could help them in what they were trying to do. And that's exactly what happened. Put them in touch with Leslie Kane, Jesse, had a conversation with this individual and a few others as well. Because, yeah, that a lot of us have a sense that something needs to happen. And I think the more we can just talk about it and try to get those pieces on the table, because you're right, if you only have a couple, it's not going to be a very clear picture, but the more pieces that are there, then you can start to do it. Not to belabor the puzzle thing, but I've been doing a lot of puzzles lately with my daughter. Apparently it's on the mind. But you said it first, though.
I did say it first.
All right.
It's a good. I mean that because that's how I look at it. It's like, imagine if you only had a couple, it doesn't do anything for you, because to extrapolate that, those couple could be these major league secrets, like these things are like, holy shit. But then if it doesn't have context, you can't take action on it, or you can't explain why necessarily. It gets a little meta when you're talking about that, but that's the truth.
Yeah, it is. And this whole phenomenon's pretty meta anyway. So
yes.
Yeah, and it's really just having it, but they're keeping us from having it. They gutted the Schumer amendment. There's just so many things, and that in itself, should be evidence that there's something happening. And I think it is for a lot of people, but they're also still just keeping this process from moving forward. And I get it, and I also just don't give a shit about it because I think it's one tiny piece of something much, much bigger. To me, the most important thing is that this is entering the public zeitgeist, and we're paying attention, and we're looking at what's at the end of that stick. We're seeing a carrot, and we're moving toward it.
This is also where it gets really, feels like it's stuck between a shit and a fart sometimes, because on the one hand...
It's a shart.
Yeah.
We have a word for that.
I say when it goes one way or the other, period. No middle ground. But, on the one hand, it's like, if your intelligence, and let's say, just for the sake of argument here, you're one of the people who's read in on all of it, okay? If that even exists. If you're there and you can simulate ahead of time how society would react to news about whatever this is, whatever this extraterrestrial, extra-tempestral, whatever it may be, phenomenon is. If you could simulate what would happen to a society of 8 billion people around the world if they were given this information, and that simulation showed that there would be catastrophic ontological shock, a complete breakdown in social structure as we know it, potential like war like we've never, all these horrible things. You might be, in that case, you very well would be in a position where, if that were true, keeping it a secret or not telling people and everything would actually be in the best interest of people. The paradox or the catch-22 to that, if you will, though, is who the fuck are you to decide that?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want to sit here and suddenly be like, yeah, let's just trust the people in intelligence because they'll never lead us astray. But
Yeah.
what if on this issue, if that were the case, what if they're right to do that?
Yeah, and then you add the component too, because another big thing we need to start doing is bring in the experiencer testimony. These are the people that have had the closest encounters. They have arguably the most. It's hard to put a word to it, but they have information that's not really being talked about or considered right now. But if you do bring in that element of it, where one of the most common things is a sense that something's coming, some sort of transformational shift, some sort of cataclysm, whether it be societal or physical. And how does that relate to this? And how does that relate to that question you just asked? Whether we all have a right to know, or would it be too disruptive if we did know? Like if there is some shitstorm coming and there's going to be a massive loss of life, whether it be nuclear war or an asteroid or something, would you want to know? You know, would we stop going to work every day in a shit job we don't like and we go home and hug our kids, or, you know, travel to the other side of the world, assuming you could still get on a plane and travel, because those people would probably be doing the same thing. So it would be sort of a collapse of society, but you might look at life differently and enjoy it differently and make different decisions. Or, you know, we just don't know and we live in ignorant bliss, and then a thing comes and we still transform, we still change, but in a different way. I'm not saying that's why they decided not to tell us, because there was Hal Puthoff mentioned, I think at the Soul Conference recently, that he was a part of a group of people that were brought in to do that exact thing, that they were meeting to discuss whether we should talk about what is actually happening or continue to keep it quiet. And a lot of them, from what he said, were pro-disclosure, and by the end, unanimously, they were like, nope, shouldn't do it, not worth it. So what is it? Like,
when
what
did he
is
say
it?
that was?
I think I just saw the video. I wasn't at the Soul Conference, but I think it was at the Soul Conference like a year ago now-ish, because the other one's coming up pretty soon.
Yeah, but when did he say those meetings took place?
I don't know that. I can't answer that question. It would probably be easy to find because he probably did mention it in that conversation, but I can't give a specific time. But it's interesting in the context of what you're talking about here. This is an existential question. This is about what we are, who we are, how we understand the universe. We all have a right to know that. But if it's also a matter of maintaining this physical reality and the society that we built, as destructive as it is, and as much as it probably needs a reset of some sort, do we want to do that? Are we capable of doing that as a government entity? And that's probably a big part of why they're afraid too. Could they even manage that? Because it would be on them to do it. If they're the ones that say it, they're the catalyst for that, it's then on them to manage it. And maybe that's a part of what they've been doing in slow motion. Like the buzz about those UFOs that were shot down over the Atlantic, outside North Carolina and Alaska, like that to me felt like a litmus test, sort of a neurolinguistic programming thing to get people to pay attention to this and to have it on their radar and to normalize it slowly over time, as opposed to just, boom, here's the information, here's the UFOs, now you have everything that you need to know. So it seems like they're doing it in a slow motion, like the drip drip of disclosure is sort of the cliche term. But that would make more sense. You get both. You can have both, assuming it's not associated with some massive cataclysm or some huge disruption to our lives. But clearly there's something else there. If it's just these aliens from this planet, they've been coming here. Sorry, they put some stuff in your butt. You know, I hope that didn't jack you up too much, you know, but clearly there's something more than just that, or we would all know already. And that's what interests me, is what is it that they're keeping from us that is likely way more disruptive than just that simple scenario.
That could take, if that is the way they're doing it, though, that could take decades.
They might have a timeline, though, too.
Yeah.
They might be coming up against something that they need us to have an awareness, or at least to have the carrot out there. If we pay attention to it, that's one thing. If we don't, that's a whole nother thing. And that's what I think existence is seeking. It's about seeking something beyond just this conventional physical reality.
That's the problem, though, because the stigma that they weaponize for so long with this is so seeped into society that still the majority of people, even when they see, Lou go on a book tour on CBS, they're like, "Oh, haha, 5 minutes on UFOs." The average person who's not into this topic and doesn't study it, they're not. They don't care. A lot of people don't care.
That's the thing that blew my mind the most about all of these just crazy revelations that have been popping up since, forever if you pay attention to it, but obviously since 2017 as a real turning point, is just how many people don't give a shit.
Yeah.
Like, it's arguably one of the biggest questions of our time with so many implications, but there's this rampant complacency. What is that? What's at the root of that? It can't just be the manufactured stigma, because a lot of those people didn't care about that or wouldn't have paid attention to that anyway. There's got to be something more. There's got to be something almost metaphysical associated with it, with the people that pay attention and the people that don't. Not that UFOs is the only thing we should be talking about, but I think UFOs is sort of a gateway into other realms of thinking that allow us to answer some more existential questions and to really open the aperture wider.
I think there's something about it with, like you say, complacency, and I think there's truth to that. But also, it's so out there, no pun intended.
It is. That's
that I think people kind of wake up, and if the thought crosses their mind when they're looking at the sky, it's almost like passively they're like, well, what the fuck am I going to do about it if that's really a thing?
Yeah.
And they don't, because they can't see it, they're like, whatever, maybe it exists, maybe it doesn't. I'm not going to sit here and worry about it.
But doesn't it also make it an important portal or potential portal for allowing you to look into different, like Amy Michelle, one of Jacques Vallée's mentors, famously said that it starts with studying UFOs, and next thing you know, you're researching Arab mystics. So maybe that UFO is the more tangible thing. You still look up and see it. You might not have the willingness or the desire to research it more, but most people do. Once they see that thing, once they connect with that and realize that their conventional reality now has to include that, it almost does act as a portal, a sort of gateway to get them to go down all of these other roads, to go down into these rabbit holes and to see what's down there. And a lot of things that emerge from that are spiritual growth and a sense of companionship and connectivity with other animals, with other people, with the environment. And maybe that is what they represent in sort of a metaphysical sense. But it takes the physical, it takes seeing that thing or being brought up onto a ship or seeing beings with an evolved consciousness that you can learn from almost instantly just by being in their presence. So I think, it almost does act as a gateway of sorts if you're willing to accept the reality of what you're seeing. And most people, it takes seeing to believing, and they see it, and then there's believing.
Well, the believing thing also has a bit of a downside too. And you referenced UFO Twitter earlier and, how that turns into sometimes. But as with everything in our society now, people put their entire meaning behind something. And so it's no different with this. You will find people who, when they get into the UFO phenomenon and studying it and seeing what it's about, it becomes a full-blown religion. And I think we've passed that point to where you can't even have a conversation with some people that in any way might interfere with what they view as this whole thing being.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's easy to get pigeonholed. There's almost like a mental stovepiping that we've done regarding this phenomenon. And it's easy to go down one rabbit hole and stay there without seeing that it's more of an ants colony where there's all these connected pieces, and it's much bigger than likely what any of us are even capable of understanding. There's some indications that it's really, if it is, so let's just stick with that analogy. If it really is sort of this gateway to opening your aperture to include other things, to broaden your awareness of what reality might be beyond the physical and into the metaphysical of sorts, then I think, like, what if there is a point where we just butt up against something that is far too disconnected from that. It's too far outside of anything that we can understand with the senses that we have. When you had Danny Sheehan in here recently, he was talking about this same thing. And I share a very similar worldview to him. It was cool to hear him say it in really eloquent terms and much better than I could, given his background, but about this universal consciousness that just divides and iterates and polarizes and becomes all of the things that exist in the physical universe over what seems to us like an infinite period of time. But to understand all of that, there's certainly things we can't because we don't have the physical sense. What he was saying is that we might be evolving a sense that is beyond the five that we're aware of. The sixth sense, that's likely the most primary sense. And that we've built these others on top as we've sort of been forced to evolve in a kind of Donald Hoffman sort of way, forced to evolve to exist in this physical reality. There's likely a connection with this universal consciousness that exists and has always existed that we've gotten away from in this physical form as we walk across the river of forgetting as we're born, that we could seek in trying to assess this UFO question and all of its implications.
Yeah, he kind of blew my mind.
Yeah,
with
that was a
whole
cool
part, too.
conversation.
Because, like, I get, and I'm sure pretty much anyone out there listening who thinks about this at all, can agree with me. It gets almost like stressful thinking about what consciousness is and how real that is. And of course, it gets back to what the meaning of it all is and who's involved with that. Is it a god? Is it aliens? Is it a simulation? Is it all the above?
Yeah,
It gets very, very weird.
It does get weird. I guess stressful too sometimes, huh? That's funny. Never really thought of it that way. But yeah, I mean, I started meeting with a psychiatrist for the first time in my life not long ago, probably because this shit is so stressful and weird.
I think you're learning something about yourself right now.
Yeah, no doubt, man, no doubt. But yeah, it is. But what else is there too? Like I was just saying, there's few things that I'm this passionately interested in anymore. Because yeah, I said in my second book that I've always been easily bored with the banality of reality, and this challenges all aspects of reality, the way that we know it. And for a lot of people who aren't inclined to seek out questions because they don't have time or they don't want to or it's not interesting, but there's a lot of other people that are really drawn to this, many of whom haven't even had an experience or an experience that maybe they don't understand, that they're not fully aware of, and they want to get at that in some capacity, but many who just see the reality of this and are like, that's all it takes for me. That's enough to widen my aperture. Let's find out what else is out there that I don't understand and didn't even know was real until recently. And I think that's a really cool aspect of this phenomenon.
Yeah. Now, you were telling me off camera that you were approached a couple years ago by someone, you didn't say like what agency or what place, and I won't put words in your mouth or anything, but you were approached in a way that kind of shocked you based on what they said to you and what happened. Could you just explain what went on there?
Yeah, that's a beautiful segue too, considering what we're talking about and how sometimes we're forced to reconceptualize our reality. And a lot of times that takes ontological shock. We have to have a very, a catalyst of some sort. And it's funny, I was just listening to an interview of Alicia Keys on Smartless coming over from the airport last night. And it was cool. She's talking about her creative process and how a lot of things that she has written have come from heartbreak or death in the family or loss. And that's really the creative process that I think opens us up to this whole universe of emotions and energy and intelligence that exists all around us. Like Danny Sheehan was talking about, if we all are just little droplets of light, little fractal iterations of source consciousness that grows out of that infinite energy, it exists everywhere, all around us, in everything. And it's cool because, like, going back to what we were talking about with religion earlier, is I was always taught to look up to the heavens because that's where God is. But if you think about it, like if these different densities of energy and consciousness exist that everything's built from, it's actually inside. You would go in like, you know, 0 point energy, for instance, or subquantum energy fields. That's likely where consciousness resides. I've heard Eric Davis say that. I've heard Hal Puthoff say that. Danny Sheehan was basically saying the same thing with these nodes of some sort of quantum, subquantum field. Um, but yeah, I think it's all related in some way. I don't know exactly how, and for the first time in a long time, I forgot your question.
It
I'm
was
usually
it
pretty
was
good at finding my way
it's
back, but I got
it's
lost
all
there,
it's
man.
all
I'm
good.
sorry.
I could see you were going down the road. I was asking about when you got
Yeah,
approached
yeah, okay,
by
okay.
someone and how that shocked you.
Right. So yeah, this was one of those times where I was forced to widen the aperture because I was done skis with all this. I was ready to jet. I was traveling a lot. I was, you know, doing too much. And the stress of not just that, but the existential questions was weighing on me. And I decided I didn't want to do it anymore. And this was sort of their avenue in, whoever they are. Because that was just a thought in my head. I had just decided that about a week before I was going to a conference called the International UFO Congress in Phoenix, Arizona. This was October 7th or 8th, probably 2022. So about a little over 2 years ago. So I just had that thought, didn't tell my wife, didn't tell anybody, decided I'd go to this conference, I'd give my talk, and that'd be it. I was working on this third book, so I decided I would finish that too, but that's a different pursuit. You can do that at home whenever you want. You know, it's not getting on a plane constantly. So I go down there, I give my talk, met this really interesting individual with a PhD who flew out to meet me to talk about his crazy ass experiences that he's been having where he interacts with these beings who have indicated to him that they are from the future. And they have different capacities with which they can contact him and interact
How
with
did they
him.
indicate that to him?
He sees them constantly. He's able to interact through his dreams and also sometimes in physical form as well. They saved his life. He gave me permission to talk about it at this conference recently. They showed up one time at the edge of his bed and said, "You need to go see so and so doctor," and he was already kind of experiencing something and had a doctor where he lived in Southern California. They're like, "No, you need to go see this doctor," like an old friend of his that lived about 3 hours away. And he was like, "Oh, okay. Like, just I need to do this. I feel compelled to do this." Um, and he was being tested for cancer in a specific area in the place where he lived. They didn't find anything. They went 3 hours away to visit this one doctor. They did the same test and they found the cancer and removed it and said, if we hadn't found this, you would have been dead in about 3 months. And it was 25 years ago. So they saved his life. And
Now, they
that
told him they're from the future. Have they said that?
they've articulated. A lot of people have. That's what's crazy. A lot of these interactions, it's not just, hey, we're from outer space, or here's the star system. Even Betty Hill, I was telling Danny Jones about this because I just learned about it too. But even Betty Hill acknowledges that they're probably time travelers now because she described their physical form, had a bust made, showed it to some biological anthropologists. They said that's likely what we'll look like in tens of thousands of years. So anyway, I'm getting off track again.
That's okay.
You need to get like a bullwhip or something.
You're good,
and just
man.
track it if I keep going down.
I like these little tangents. I'm also the one asking the questions, getting you down there, so don't worry about it. But you were talking about going to the conference.
Yeah. So I was on my way to this conference in about a week or so. I'd already had a strange experience where I felt like I was having a telepathic conversation through a huge light, a very overt light in my neighbor's yard, like a security light that sits up high. And I was just out there one night and I felt like I was having a back and forth conversation, which the next day I wrote off as just being a figment of my imagination, And of course, this is when people could argue, which I think is unjustified, that, we associate voices in your head with some sort of mental disability or schizophrenia or whatever, which I don't have. And I think everybody has some sort of intuitive connection to this broader consciousness that we are all aware of, but oftentimes because of those stigmas don't really pay attention to it much. Like the intuitions that we feel, the synchronicities that we experience, a lot of that is just trying to get us to pay attention to this much broader holistic reality that bridges the physical and the metaphysical. So I didn't take it seriously. I was still very in the physical, reductionist, materialist camp. I'd kind of been emerging from that. I had been to a conference at the Esalen Institute and have really, gotten to know a lot of people who study this and other phenomena like near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, and I take that seriously. Even though I haven't had one, I'm aware they exist, and I'm interested in what people describe when they visit the other side. But I wasn't there, and I sort of wrote it off the next morning as just whatever, even though it was a very real conversation. So I go to this conference, give my talk, meet with this guy who had his life saved by future humans, and then for some reason took like a 3-hour nap. I never take naps. Woke up late for this this VIP thing where there's booze and there's schmoozing happening and people can pay extra money to meet the speakers. And I was one of the speakers at this thing. Go to this Halloween party downstairs because it was right before Halloween in 2022. I'm out of money, and one of the participants, she runs audio video, name's Heidi. She doesn't mind me using her name. We've kind of all gone public with this in various ways. Is like, hey, I have a key to the VIP room. We'll go up and get some beers, bring them back down, and then you don't have to just go get money and pay $8 for a beer. So I'm like, cool. At this point, it's now clear to me that Heidi wasn't necessarily Heidi. She wasn't the one saying that or the one doing this, because we went up to this room, get the beers, shoved a couple in my pockets for my friends downstairs, and then I wasn't allowed to leave. And I'm like, what are we doing here? Why can't I leave? She's like, oh, my friend Eric wants to talk to you. I'm like, who the hell is Eric? She's like, oh, don't worry, you'll like him. And she just kept saying that over and over for like 15 or 20 minutes. And I'm losing my mind.
And
I'm
you're
like,
locked in this room.
I'm not locked in the room, but I couldn't leave. I wasn't, it kind of went beyond just, I'd like to wait for Eric. It was like a weird, just an inability to really conceptualize anything other than just staying there until Eric got there. Like I kept thinking about it. I would have that thought and I would say this and I would get frustrated, but I couldn't just be like, fuck this, I'm leaving. Maybe I could have. I don't know. That's a great question. I never really thought about it before in that capacity, but eventually I did just give up. Like there was something about that and the way she was saying it and how she was saying it.
Hypnotizing.
Almost, yeah. Yeah, almost. That's funny. I never thought about that aspect of it or even asked, why didn't I just leave? So anyway, I did eventually resign to the fact that I wasn't leaving, sat down in this chair, and then this Eric guy comes in, pulls up a chair right into me, like, right with his knee in my crotch, like hits my crotch. And his face is right here, complete stranger. This Eric that we had been waiting for, who really wanted to talk to me, who I knew nothing about, and he knew nothing about me. He didn't know who I was. He pulls up this chair right here and says, we know you've been thinking about quitting lately, and we'd really prefer you not do that yet. And that was a very triggering event for me because
you never said anything.
I never said that out loud. There was a thought in my head that I just had while doing dishes. My wife was behind me, didn't even say anything to my wife. Not like she would know this complete stranger anyway and call him and be like, hey, he's thinking about quitting. Like just some dude.
Yeah.
But that's the thing. He wasn't really him either. He wasn't Eric in this moment. Like he was. And I've gotten to know him. And
yeah, what do you mean by that? You said the same thing about Heidi. She wasn't Heidi, and now he wasn't Eric.
Right. So at first, I didn't know what the fuck he was or who he was. All I knew is he knew my thoughts. And as the conversation unfolded, it was apparent that I was speaking to some sort of non-local consciousness that is aware of everything about me and also my future. And they were also the same non-local consciousness that I did in fact speak to through that light earlier that year. Because I asked a question, they allowed me to ask questions in this moment. And one of my questions was something I asked while talking to that light. And they said, we already spoke about that before you went to Rice University for this conference, which was right before I went to. And I was having anxiety about it. So I was like talking to this light about my anxiety and traveling and what I was doing. And that was supposed to be like apparently some sort of mediating exchange where I would feel better. But I wrote it off the next day. I didn't pay attention to it. Now they brought this dude with his knee in my crotch and his face right here and these really mesmerizing eyes to tell me to my face, because apparently I need that physical aspect of this, that we know what you're thinking. We prefer you not do that. I was allowed to ask questions. There was sort of a conversation. Slowly it shifted from being back and forth, vocalized conversation to purely telepathical.
Oh, you were going telepathic with him.
Yeah. Well, and it happened so organically. I can't even identify the exact point when it happened. But,
so you could hear his thoughts without his mind.
And Heidi's too. At some point, we just stopped using our voices. But I could hear them and their voices in my head, and they could hear mine. I could hear my own as I was saying things telepathically. The first indication of that is when they said, we'd really prefer you not quit yet, I'd say, how could you know that? And they said, once you know who we are, you'll know how we know that. And then I thought, future humans, ? But I thought it telepathically, and they answered that before I said it. So that also is weird, that not only are this happening, that they know my thoughts, but I also communicated that telepathically, and they answered it before I said it out loud. Eventually, the whole conversation turned telepathic. So you've got these three people, Eric sitting right in front of me, Heidi, who's to my left, just staring at each other, not saying anything. And people are starting to come in. There were these three women that came out because they were kind of concerned about me. They knew me, and I knew them. And they came out, and this Eric, or whoever was communicating through Eric, said, "Can you close the door behind you?" All three of them turned at the exact same time, went in, closed the door. Nobody came out the rest of the evening. And things happened that we can get into.
Yeah, let's get into it.
So things happened, and nobody else came out, but people were watching us. And there was some level of concern and like, what the fuck's going on out there? So what they eventually got to after the question answer session was that they came there to put three things in my brain that would be important for some future times. So again, some indication that they know the future, and specifically mine, but also I get the sense it's for something else. I don't think it's just I'm going to be out walking my dog and then I suddenly say this thing. I have the sense that it's something possibly related to all of the things that are happening. But I have no idea because they told me before they did this, they asked my permission. It was all very nice. The whole experience was your classic love and light sort of thing, which again indicates that it's some sort of more evolved consciousness, I think. But they asked very politely. They told me I wouldn't have access to it. I wouldn't remember it, but I would see it coming in. And they would black my eyes out, and I would see this information coming in, and then they would release me from that. I'd go about my business. Do we have your permission? It was all very like a free will oriented. We need you to choose. Do you agree to this? So at this point, and this is where...
Did you feel like you could say no, though? Like
I did. I did. But I wouldn't have, because what happened throughout the course of this vocalized and then telepathic conversation is I started to remember. I was made to or allowed to remember things in possibly a pre-incarnate state.
Pre-incarnate state.
Yeah. That I had been a part of before I came here in this body and walked across the river of forgetting.
And what did that look like?
I don't know, but I felt a familiarity and an awareness of something. And I'm sure this sounds absolutely insane, but it was the intuitive sense that I had that who I was interacting with through Heidi and Eric were entities, beings, intelligences, consciousnesses who were familiar to me. I knew them. And then I knew me, and I knew our relationship. So I wouldn't have said no. I could have said no, but they had already brought me to the point where it's like, oh shit, yeah, that's right. Yeah, okay, let's do this thing. And so then I was actively engaged. I was a part of it. And what happened was exactly what they said. My eyes went black, like somebody pulling a curtain down over them from top to bottom. I see all of this information streaming in super fast. Like it was so intense. Like a fire hose is blasting you in the eyeballs. A bunch of color and like light, and it's swirling and it's moving. And apparently I could see the information at the time as it was passing through, because occasionally Heidi telepathically, or no, I think she vocalized that. I can't remember. They became so confused. But I heard her in my mind, or possibly in my ears, I don't know, say, "Did you get that? Did you get that one? Did you see that?" And I'd be like, "Uh-huh, uh-huh." So I could see it, but then once it was in there, gone. There's no access to it at all. And they told me that, and I agreed to that, so that's fine. But it also kind of sucks because people are like, "What'd they tell you? What'd they tell?" I don't know. And they told me I wouldn't know, and they asked if that was okay, and I said yes. So they finish up. I have no idea how much time passed. It was kind of a missing time thing, which makes sense because we were all kind of out of the bodies that register time. I kind of felt this as even before they put me in this sort of mesmerized hypnotic state. I kind of remember feeling like I was lifted above my body, like we were all kind of meeting in the crown chakra or something, to
In the
use
what?
the crown chakra. I'm using terms that maybe are relatable to people, like you sort of lift it out and we're just here. I could still hear their voice in my head. I could hear my voice in my head, but it kind of felt like I wasn't fully in my body the way I experience it every other time.
Yeah.
This was the only time that's ever happened.
Not that you're on it, but like kind of parallel to what some may say you get in psychedelic experiences a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And near death experiences of all sorts. There's this cool book, Impossibility of Things. Oh, I wish I could remember the name of it. I'll text you later. Maybe you can put it in the show notes. But it's about a woman who was blown up by an IED in Iraq, and she was dead for a while. Her time had stopped. She entered this space, this time space that exists outside of the physical when we live our lives in. And she interacted with these beings who showed her all of these different pathways where her body could be put back together. And they were having fun with it. They were joking around.
Beings.
Yeah, these entities, these energetic forms that apparently exist all around us that we're not aware of because of our limited senses and how we can perceive the universe.
Did she say what they look like or how she perceived them?
Some are human-like, they were just energetic entities that could take on any form. You hear that a lot with these people that have these types of experiences, but they took on a form familiar to her, and she was allowed to work with them to put her body back together in all these different ways. And they would be like, "Okay, what if you didn't have a leg? What would your life look like?" And they could instantly see her entire life with no leg. What if this eye that was hanging down from the side of her skull wasn't put back in and you lost that eye? And they were just messing around with her like she was a doll, and she was an active participant in this. And she was able to see, and they could just be like, "Boop, do that," and then that whole lifetime, what that looks like. So she didn't want to go back. She was like, "Physical reality sucks balls, and I don't want to be a part of that anymore." I don't think those are the words she used, but it's kind of like what I was feeling in a much smaller capacity. I didn't just get exploded in Iraq, but I was like, I'm just tired, and I kept saying that to them, and I felt like a giant wuss. And eventually I was like, man, I need to suck it up because this is small potatoes, how I feel in this thing. But she articulated that too. And then eventually she was like, "Okay, I can go back. Let's try to make it a way I can go back. I need support. I can't just go back to the life I had. I don't want to, especially with all of these physical problems I'm going to have because I just got exploded." So they found like sort of a mutually agreed upon way that she could exist, and she got to be a part of it. And I've been reading a lot of channeled material lately because I now see that channeling is real. I never would have before this interaction, but that's essentially what was happening.
Channeling?
Yeah, so it's also known as a state of deep trance mediumship, where the physical form, the instrument, the body, is used for this information to come through. And that's exactly what this was. Like Eric and Heidi were there as physical beings, but their consciousness was being used to convey information and exchange information in this way. It's very much one way. They were just putting things into my brain. But we did have a dialogue for a while. I was allowed to ask questions in the same way that people do with this channeling material. So like the Seth material was one of the first ones. And then the raw contact, the law of one, is a really interesting one, the Quo material. There's a lot of individuals who have channeled, and it's interesting because they're saying very similar things. about what exists beyond this physical world. This is almost an illusion of sorts or a simulation, but that's not the right word. And we're here to have experiences, polarized experiences that can contribute to the evolution of the entire system. That this is a place where learning happens and suffering happens. And through that suffering, like we were talking about with Alicia Keys, things can come through and we can grow and we can learn. There's a lot of people singing her songs that come from that place that then build and grow, and the consciousness learns about itself from these existences. And this gets out there, this gets meta as shit, but it's real. And it's one of these things, like for someone to see a UFO and they're like, oh wait, that's real. I want to figure out what that is. After this happened to me, I had to try to figure out what the fuck this is and what this physical existence is and how it relates to this broader awareness of a different thing outside this physical reality.
And to be clear, the guy, Eric, the guy you were talking to, if I understood that correctly, he's basically saying he's a future human.
No, not at all.
So I missed that.
That was my initial thought, because they knew the future. They knew my future. So I assumed that individual and their consciousness was who knew that. Eric, I would not say he's a normal person. He's had a UFO encounter. His life, his mentality, his brain wiring has been changed. He was pinned down by a UFO and became a different person. Yeah, like held down by a UFO. There's a lot of instances of this happening actually in the UFO literature, where I wrote about one that Jacques Vallée wrote about in Passport to Magonia, I think, where this geologist was taken into UFO, stood in front of a computer for what he thought, was like an hour or so. Came back out and he was missing for 4 or 5 days. His dad was like the general of the army, so mounted this massive search. They couldn't find him. He had this little flower in his lapel, and he comes out. He's walking around. Eventually, somebody finds him. Like, dude, where were you? Where were you? The flower's perfectly the same. It wasn't wilted. He didn't have beard growth or anything. He was just in front of this computer, having this information exchange, similar to what happened with me, but inside of a craft. And then suddenly his sleep changed, which also happened to me. He knew things. He was already in college, and he just didn't really even have to go to class anymore. He just knew everything they were talking about. He would take math classes, and it was just intuitive. It was in there. So Eric sort of experienced that same sort of thing, because I've gotten to know him. I was scared shitless to talk about this. It really fucked me up for a while.
So you still talk with him?
Yeah. It was actually the first time I ever talked about this publicly was with Jesse Michaels, because he was one of the first people I told about it. I was already doing something with him in December. This happened in mid-October, so it was still pretty fresh. And I was solidly fucked up for like 3 months. First 3 weeks, 4 weeks were really tough, but then even by the time I was hanging out with him in LA, it came up, and I needed to unload, and he's just looking at me like, what? and then he brought me back down about 6 or 7 months later, and I got the sense he would want to talk about it, because it's kind of a weird thing, and I think it has helped a lot of other people by talking about this, because I've found a lot of people have had similar experiences and don't know what to do with it, in the same way that I was struggling to attempt to fit it within my worldview box as well. So yeah, I was telling him about this, and when I first did, I didn't know what word to use for Eric, because I didn't know what he was or who he was. And I assumed his consciousness, his body. I had no reason to think otherwise. And then I was sitting, his doco came out right before Thanksgiving, and I was sitting at the Thanksgiving table. We were about to eat, and he pops up on Facebook Messenger. He found me and sent me a message, and his face that came up, he still has his profile picture. You can go look at it if you want. It's hilarious. But it's all like mesmeric and like flowy colors, and it's right here, just like he was in my face when he's doing this thing. And it said, I think it's time for us to talk. That was his message to me. So already eerie ass picture, really cryptic message. I think it's time for us to talk. And it really triggered me hard. Like it sent me back to all those things I'd been coping with, that I did cope with, and that got better, but put me right back there.
Yeah.
Like, oh shit, he's real. He's a person, and I've got to know him. He is a person.
What is his background?
I don't really know a lot of details. A lot of things we talk about tend to be related to this. He's open about this. Heidi also willing to tell her story. I don't think she enjoys doing it as much, but Eric is really trying to help people. And he does have a fascinating backstory that I think really helps to conceptualize a lot of why he was there and how he was used and why he was used, because he does have abilities that I think stem from his UFO encounter that allowed him to shoot that information into my brain harder than most people could, and faster too, because there was a timetable. Like, there were people coming into this room. By the time they let me out, I mean, there's probably 15 or 20 people in there. I don't know. And I couldn't,
15, 20 people.
yeah,
And
in
you've
this
been having this
VIP room
telepathic conversation.
outside on the porch, yeah. And it was crazy because I couldn't even lift my head to see. Like, as I walked through the room, somebody put their hand on my arm and said, "Are you okay?" Because again, there was, as I learned later, there was some concern about what was happening. I just go, uh-huh. Walked out of the room, down the hall. Fortunately, I was only about 5 doors down from that VIP room where this party was gathering. Laid back, slept for 13 hours, woke up, cried uncontrollably for like 4 or 5 hours. Went downstairs into the foyer to give a book to my friend John Dover. We were just in the George Knapp's doco together. I've known him for a while. Gave him my second book, and as I'm doing that, just bursting from the inside with all of this emotion and confusion and ontological shock, essentially, Eric comes around the corner. There's no reason for him to have been there at that time. Comes around the corner, puts his hand on my shoulder and says, "Are you okay?" And I was like, Like, my brain was just mush, but it did take away a lot of that, because I was on a panel that same day. I had to like function, the end of conference banquet was happening. There's a lot of stuff that I needed to exist in this physical reality for. And they, through him, in that moment, because they knew where I would be, happened to find a great space to catch me as I'm walking through, and then help to alleviate a lot of that anguish that was associated with the shock of that event.
When it switched over, to go back to the event, when it switched over to telepathy, obviously, like, this goes on, as you said, for a little while, and it kind of naturally does it, and you can hear their thoughts and they can hear yours. Did it feel, I'm trying to think how I even want to ask this, but did it feel like you were delayed in understanding what was happening, or were you simultaneously understanding everything that's happening and also being like, holy shit, wow, we're talking to each other's brains right now?
Yeah, it was a progression for sure. It started out, again, vocalized, and then, like I said, I didn't even really notice that it turned telepathic. But then eventually I did. And I'm like, okay, this is weird. But everything was already weird leading up to it from the very first thing they did, tell me they knew what was in my brain. But then, yeah, it was kind of this accelerating curve of the speed at which it happened and the understanding. And it was kind of like a remembering, like I'm just, and able to then take that awareness, get my own consciousness out of the way, because I needed that to happen to put the stuff in it in the first place. So I did start to kind of remove my consciousness from this vessel, which allowed me greater clarity in the things that were said and a faster rate with which I could understand them.
All right, real quick, let's break, grab you some lunch, and then we'll come back and dig into this a little more.
Yeah, sounds great.
All right, we're back. Actually, one thing we didn't get into before we took a break was, what did your wife think of all this? Like, and how did that conversation go down where you told her about everything that happened?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the next morning, after I woke up with all my clothes on, my shoes on, my feet still on the floor, and was crying uncontrollably, which I think was kind of a physiological response to whatever it was they put in my brain, because I didn't really feel like sadness or anything. It was just that I couldn't stop crying, and it was weird. And so I texted her, and I said, "I think I met them last night, and I can't stop crying." And she was like, "Happy tears?" I'm like, I don't know. I don't know. I just can't stop, and it's driving me crazy.
I think I met future humans, and her first question is, happy tears?
I mean, it's a fair question. Like, well, are you excited about this? And, and I also didn't know, like, in my mind, it was future humans. I telepathically asked them that. But it's interesting, and I think important to point out that they didn't say yes in that moment.
Mm.
They just carried on. So it was like they said, once you know how we know that, you'll know who we are, essentially. And I thought future humans, and then they moved on. So the implication is that's who it is, but I get the sense that that's an oversimplification. Just to clarify that point. But yeah, no, so I was like, I don't even know where to start, because she's obviously like, what happened? And I couldn't call her because I had all this other shit I had to do for the rest of the conference. But when I got home, I told her the whole thing, start to finish, all the little details. And yeah, my kids were there too. And for a while, it was super weird because, I didn't talk about it a lot, but there were people I felt comfortable discussing it with because I'm trying to figure it out myself, and I still am. I don't know what the hell this is. But it did help talking to people, but their faces were always the same. It was kind of creepy, actually.
Mm.
There's just like kind of a blank stare, And
Might be because you can't possibly process something like that if you weren't there.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that's a big part of it for me too. I'm still, I've come to grips with the reality of it, but the implications I'm still working on. There was a period of time where that was really hard too, but it's gotten better. But yeah, I think the reason they did it the way they did was not just so I paid attention, having two people there, but also having the people inside helps for the reality of it for other people who weren't there. Because it's like, oh wait, there were witnesses to this. It was like we were in a little telepathy gallery or something. We're out on this balcony, and there's a gaggle of people inside watching this with concern about what's going on. And so I think, that's helpful. Like when I talk about the conversation I feel like I had with that light that they referenced, it's just me and this light. There's nobody else there. Even if they were, they'd be like, why is this dude just staring at this light? But I think a big part of why it went down the way it did on that balcony with these two other people and with the people inside and with the three women that came out is so there's witnesses, essentially. Like, oh, that did happen. I saw this, interchange taking place.
You've done a lot of work in your research and in your books about, reported experiencers, and we've already talked about it a little bit today. And essentially what we're saying here is that you are one too through this experience in your own way. But how do you separate out what seems like, I want to ask this correctly, but like what seems like people just piling on the train of I want to be able to say I was a part of something versus things that actually seem like they are plausible?
Yeah.
If we even know what plausible is in this kind of sense.
Right. Well, speaking personally, I didn't want to be a part of that at all. It was really hard for me to talk about this. It's gotten easier. But at first, and even, it was a year later before I did finally talk about this publicly for the first time. And I think it's probably the same with most people. In fact, a part of why I did decide to share this experience publicly was what I told you off camera, that one of the questions I was allowed to ask, I asked, can I talk about this? And they specifically said, we want you to talk about this. But the other part is, you're right, in researching and writing my second book, I'm drawing from the experiences of people who are brave enough to talk about very odd experiences that most people don't believe. And I dedicated my book to them, to the brave women and men who were willing to do this, because we can't get information without it. So it was a combination of being compelled to talk about it because they told me, when I asked if I could, but also realizing I'm a hypocrite if I'm acknowledging these people who did and I'm not doing that. So yeah, but it's hard, and we do need discernment. We do need to absolutely take everything with a grain of salt and be critical. Does this person have a motive, or their intentions there that maybe are impure? I think we should be doing that with everything related to this phenomenon. But yeah, I don't know. It's hard because there's different levels. J. Allen Hynek, in his book, The UFO Experience, he took a lot of what he was doing in running Project Blue Book and tried to apply it to all of these different cases. He had this metric for strangeness and reliability. Reliability went up if there's other people involved. The strangeness had a higher score if it was outside of our conventional reality or what craft can do within our reference frame here in this time and space. And I think we can apply that to a lot of cases. And to really understand it, it seems that the stranger it is, the harder it is to believe. But that also maybe makes it easier to believe too. It was kind of a funny scale.
What do you mean?
Well, in the sense that it's harder to, it's easier to explain away with a lower score. Can be like, well, it moved and it didn't have lights quite right. But that's different than something coming down right in front of you and sucking you up into it and taking you away and
Yes.
gallivanting around the stars or whatever. So I think all of those toward the end of that spectrum are hard to believe based on conventional notions of what we have and what those things can do. But I think the big thing for me, and this is what I was trying to do with this second book, the Extra-Tempestral model, is look for patterns across them. Can we identify recurring themes and patterns in each of these different cases? And then what can we learn from those? So I took, ironically, what's called an abductive approach, where you're looking at as much as you can. I know it's hilarious. But that is actually the name for this scientific methodological approach, where you look at everything, or as much as you can, with discernment in sampling. But then what you try to do is make inference to the best explanation. So I didn't come into this to prove that the extra-tempestral model is correct. I wanted to look at a number of different cases that span 90 years over 5 different continents to see what emerges from that and what explanation may fit that data the best. And a lot of them, this time travel model does, but there's other ones too that can also fit the data. So I'm not trying to give priority to this specific model, but rather to take in this abductive approach to try to find inference to the best explanation. And that's one of them, but I think there's others as well.
Before we get to some of the other possible explanations, how did you whittle it down to 14 cases? Like what was the logic there and how did that happen?
Oh, man, that's a tough one. Yeah. So largely what we do in anthropology is we look at things across space and through time. So I knew I wanted to have a broad view with regard to the same phenomenon and how it impacts people differently in different places. So within that, that's a starting point. And then within that, a lot of it was just an intuitive sense of how we can identify themes and patterns within and among them. So, for instance, and it's hard because I did them in sequential order. So, for instance, the first case with Mike and Leo Dworshak in the Dakotas was in the 1930s. But there's elements of that also tie into some of the case studies later in the book that took place in the aughties and the teens. So it's kind of hard because you have to lay a foundation, but also link these themes together in the book through time, but also throughout these consecutive case studies. And it kind of came together in a way that makes me wonder how much agency I even had over that. Like how we were talking about Alicia Keys earlier and how she just kind of opens the portal to the Akashic record or whatever we want to call it. And I heard Paul Simon say a similar thing in a conversation with Stephen Colbert recently where he's like asking about his creative process. And eventually he's just like, in so many words, it kind of just comes. You connect and it comes through. And it's the same thing with, like, I've written probably 85, 90 songs. Most of them have just been something I poop out, like in that moment, you open up and there it is. If I try to write a song over the course of weeks or months, it's garbage, But one of my favorite songs, according to my bandmates and friends, was one of these that I probably wrote the entire thing, lyrics, melody, and music within an hour.
Isn't it so magical when that happens?
It's crazy. You feel so connected to everything.
Now, were you sitting down writing other things before you got to that song, or are you saying it happened within an hour where you literally sat down to write and just this song came out?
Oh, that's a good question too. I don't remember the exact way in that moment. I just remember it kind of pouring out. And yeah, it'd be interesting to know what catalyst existed, if there was some sort of thing that helped kind of unlock that pathway. Oh, I
So
remember. I ate
strange.
a half ounce of mushrooms. Just kidding. But that would probably do it, honestly.
It probably would. There's something about it though. There's this great explanation Ed Sheeran has where he shows a dirty faucet or a faucet with dirty water coming out. And then he shows another picture where the faucet now has clean water coming out.
Yeah.
And he's like, the idea that you get right to that without getting through this first part is very, very rare. Occasionally can happen where like just the right thing comes together in the right flow and you're like, whoa, what is that? I remember one time I was in a studio with some producers up here in North Jersey, who the guys who work with like Fetty Wap and all those guys when they were blowing up. And I was in there for like a few different sessions, and every time it was like, they were working out different beats, like, no, it's not good. Oh, let's build on that, whatever. And then maybe the second or third time we were in there, like one night, literally sat down, and within like 5 minutes, I'm just sitting next to the producer, and he just starts with like this tone. And he's like, ooh, boom, 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 boom.
Yeah.
And then he's like, all right, and then he just hits something. We got real silent. Hits something else, boom, and then he flips over this table, adds in a little bass to it, and then comes over, puts some snares on. I'm like, and suddenly, I'm telling you, it was within 10 minutes. It was completely together, and you had something that to this day I can't figure out why they didn't make that song. It's like, oh my God, I can see that bumping in every club in America. And the thing is, it just doesn't work like that sometimes. It's sometimes like that little magic comes down, and you can't control it. But when it does, you better ride that shit.
Absolutely. I think magic's a great word for it too, because it feels magical. And to your question about how I selected these, Jeff Kripal, I think others have coined this phrase too, but a literary angel. Like how a book will just kind of come off the shelf, or it's sticking out just a little bit, or you flip to this page that happens to be exactly what you need. That happens so much in that book. The first one, it took 7 years to write. A lot of research. There's over that one was faster, much faster. My first book's called the Identified Flying Objects. I published it in 2019, and it's a really dense, thorough scientific investigation of this question. So that one focuses on this question specifically, draws from physics, astronomy, astrobiology, anthropology, and some of the other social sciences to some extent. But that one, it's been called dense by a lot of people. There's a lot of technical terms. I define all of them, but unless you like love science, it's not going to be something that you would necessarily just read and be like, oh. So I wrote the second book that had a ton of literary angels in it, where I'm flipping through. I know I kind of want to write about this, but I don't know exactly how. Boom, there it is. I just flipped to that page. Whoa. Or a book kind of just shows itself on the shelf. And then that one took about 2 years to write. And then this one definitely came from the ether, because I sat down, my truck was getting fixed at the Ford garage, and I went to this restaurant that was in parking distance with a couple notebooks, because I had an idea that I was going to write a fiction book, which I've never written prior to this point, and did some research on how to write fiction and, the storylines, how they progress, just to have the framework. But then I sat down and I filled these notebooks in their entirety in the time it took between dropping off my truck and picking it up at this restaurant that I went to. And it felt like one of those things, like writing a song or doing a painting, or the thing with the producer where it just kind of comes together, and the entire framework was there for that book. And I'd modify things and add it, but it's the same as it was that I scribbled in those notebooks. It's just one of those things where you like kind of just open yourself.
You see it.
And then let the magic happen.
Yeah.
And that's how it was with the second book, the Extra-Tempestral model, where I'm like, I know what I want to write. If I try to force it, it's never going to happen. If I just kind of sit back and wait for those book angels to come down and help. Actually a really great example of this is Whitley Strieber. To come back to him in a very different capacity. One thing I learned, that this started happening to me after my contact experience, I started having time slips. My sleep was highly disrupted. I would always wake up between 3 and 5 a.m. And it used to drive me insane. I was like, what is happening? I need sleep. I was busy at work and dealing with teenage angst, not my own, but my daughter's. I probably didn't need to clarify that, but my repressed teenage angst coming through in the wee hours of the morning. No, but life was just hard already. I was dealing with this contact experience. I didn't know what to make of it. And I was always up, and sometimes up for like an hour and a half. So I'm listening to Whitley on my friend Kelly Chase's podcast, UFO Rabbit Hole, and he's talking about how that happens to him too. And this conference I went to at Rice University, opening the Archives of the Impossible, that I went to right after my Talking to the Light experience, where I was sort of talking to the light as a sort of a way of seeking comfort in what was happening and all of the traveling and these insane intellectual conversations. At that conference, he was saying he gets up between 3 and 5 to meditate. And I was like, this dude's insane. Like he's setting an alarm, but it's not what happens. He's so tapped in to this other possibly all-encompassing reality that he has just woken up. And there's a name for it. It's called Brahma Muhurta. And it's existed throughout the world and through time, and they gave a name to it in the Hindu tradition. I think that's where it came from. Sounds very Hindu. Brahma Muhurta, where you wake up specifically at like an hour and 46 or hour and 45 minutes before sunrise. And I noticed it was changing too. So in the winter, it would be earlier. In the summer, it would be later. And it's completely linked to sunrise. But what I found is that when this happens, I was looking at it as this horrible thing that made me tired, and I was just grumpy the whole day, which doesn't work well with teenage angst, I'll point out.
No.
There was a lot of headbutting that was happening in my household at that point. But then, after listening to Whitley talk about it, and I got to tell him this story in Esalen and a group of other academics and researchers, after hearing what he does with it is that time, there's a lot less interference because there's not a lot of people awake at that time in your general space and time. And you can actually have access to information and energy that you can draw into your body and into your mind during this Brahma Muhurta time that happens. So, and that was a switch for me. I started looking at it completely differently and started to meditate in that time and lay there and focus and draw energy and draw information and use it in a way that was empowering. So as opposed to a detriment, it became an asset. And I was suddenly energized. I had new things to think about, new ways of thinking about them. And it was something that was new following this new awareness, but also I feel like a change to the physiology of my brain too. Whatever happened on that balcony in Phoenix, I think changed something because I felt the physiological effects of that. My head felt heavy and I couldn't stop crying. And then, the things with the time and the wakefulness at this specific time, I really flipped the way I thought about it and started to use it as opposed to seeing it as a detriment.
Do you think that when something like that so heavy happens to you, obviously we're humans, we dwell on it because we're like, oh my God, you're questioning everything or whatever. But sometimes as you get farther away from something, the dwelling can get more stressful because you start to wonder, like, wait, did I feel this way about it? Did I feel that way about it? Did this happen? Like, you remember the story, but you're getting farther and farther away. So maybe it, like the ontological shock in a way, kind of increases more. Do you ever feel like there could be instances where maybe some confirmation bias could come in some of your findings or things relative to you as it relates to this experience you had?
Absolutely. Yeah. So when all of this insane stuff started happening, and I feel bad even using the word insane because that helps perpetuate the bias and the way that we look at it, but these non-conventional things, which began as it did with most people in seeing UFOs. I finally did have a UFO encounter of my own from a distance, but it was clearly non-ordinary, and it followed all of the same patterns as a normal UFO does in the nighttime sighting of that sort. But it was shortly thereafter that this wave of strange phenomena started to take place. And recognizing that, I wrote it down. So as it was happening, I wrote it all down, so that I would have a pure, unbiased record of those events. I haven't gone back and read it, but it's possible that certain elements of it have been somewhat modified over time. And I absolutely do things now and study things now and look at things in a way I wouldn't without those. Some aspect of that could be biased, and that I'm seeking out things that are related to that, not to know something. I'm not looking at it with a specific end in mind or a specific goal, but I've been opened up to new ways of thinking that lead me down a different path. But even in doing that, there's some bias inherent in it. So yeah, I think the problem would be if I was drawing conclusions and then working backward from it, which is the opposite of what I'm doing. I am trying to figure out what it is that happened to me personally. That's my starting point. But also recognizing that there's really no ego in it. It's really more of a quest to understand the world, the universe, the way we're all related, but without any sort of seeking to like confirm something for myself. Like in those moments, I was kind of brought into a space where I felt a collective unity that didn't really leave much space for ego. And that was one of the hardest parts, is that I came away from this experience with a very diminished sense of self. And it's been hard to get that back. I think that was part of the struggle. I went through another sort of dark period pretty recently, actually, about 2 or 3 months ago, where I was trying to get self back. I felt like I was being pulled apart. Yeah, so I guess another way of saying this would be, so I recently became chair of my department, and that comes with a lot of work and a really strong focus on collaboration, working with others, doing this job that was hard for me to care about because I had also gotten a foot in this other life.
Yeah.
And it was like my feet were in two different worlds being pulled apart, ripping me up from the bottom, like some sort of James Bond torture device or something. And that was really hard. You know, that stress on my proverbial groin in this metaphor was really difficult. So and a lot of it I realized is because I need to be present in this body, in self, in these moments where I'm doing this job as a professor, as a chair, interacting with these things that seem so insignificant because there's these bigger questions. Not that I have answers to those questions, but the seeking and the trying to understand takes you so far out and so far away from where that other foot is that you really do feel stretched apart. So I guess when I say I was seeking self again or seeking a sense of ego, it was in trying to bridge that gap and understand that I am in this body and I am experiencing things and I have to be a part of this world and be present for things and can still ask questions that take me far away from there. I've heard Dean Radin talk about this, where a lot of people who have odd experiences that challenge their notions of reality erect a filter and they can look through that filter. But if you get too far gone, and then it brings up questions of actual mental illnesses.
Yeah.
You know, I just listened to a book about the telepathy tapes and how kids with autism likely are just, they have a different way of sensing. They can understand, speak telepathically. They can know things without even knowing themselves. That they didn't read a book, but if they know someone that is reading a book, they can just listen to the thoughts of that person and know what the entire book is about. Yeah.
Whoa.
So there's all of these ways of understanding where we look at an autistic kid and say, oh, they're dancing around. They have no idea what's going on in reality. They might have a better sense of that, like what Danny Sheehan was talking about, where we might be evolving our consciousness to have that sense that we always had, and we erected these more physical senses that get in the way of that. And stuff like, you know, obviously there's a scale there, and people can become dangerous, but if they're at the outskirts of this, you know, if they have schizophrenia, they might have access to something that instead of seen as a mental illness, we should see it as something that should be studied because it might give us insights into different ways that the mind can work in different situations.
Yeah, I think sometimes I've said this before, but when you look at people who are a real genius at something, whatever it is, could be art, could be sports, could be science, anything. Like the creme de la creme, the best there are, there always seems to be some sort of, I don't want to use the word kryptonite, but like they it's almost like they have a price that they pay for that genius.
Yeah.
Right? And so for their mind to be able to work this way, other things are just off. I'll give you an example. Kanye West. Kanye West says certifiably insane shit, right? And sometimes it gets completely out of control, and sometimes it doesn't make sense to anyone else except him. But Kanye West is audio-visually probably the most genius person to ever walk this earth. He can create sounds and create imagery as well that other people can't even process how you would even get to that point.
Right.
And I kind of wonder if there is something, some sort of, wrong word to use here, but just for the sake of not being able to think of the right one, some sort of bastardization of the consciousness that has to do with that.
Yeah, absolutely. Neurodivergent people seem to have more abilities or different ways of thinking about things that give them insights. Even traumatic brain injuries. You have people that experienced a car crash and suddenly they can solve complex mathematical formulas. I know a woman personally, I met her in 2019, who was in a car crash, severe brain damage, and became, without having ever painted in her life, an amazing painter.
Whoa.
And I think that works both ways. Like we were talking about with musicians, like music sort of changes your brain structure too. Psychedelics as well, in any sort of way that you can sort of get in harmony with the cosmic existence that we're a part of. I think it works both ways. Like the music comes from that space, but the music and rewiring your brain to be able to do music with other people, especially, because you're creating something together. And sometimes, people are in different moods, you're not vibing, but then there's other times where exactly what everybody's playing and how they're playing it, and it just flows so beautifully. It's kind of like, I don't know, but it happens with other stuff too, like those group mediumship things where, like maybe you've heard Leslie Kane talk about seeing this ectoplasm form into hands, and then she would take molds of these hands, like it actually comes into existence. But one person, spoon bending's another one, these... what's it called? PK parties, psychokinesis, where people can bend spoons. It takes that group to be able to bring that energy that helps it happen, with the exception of select few, like not Ingo Swann. I always get him mixed, Uri Geller. Like he can just do it.
Yeah.
But it takes usually that group energy that you see in the mediumship and, spoon bending with music, art, creativity. But yeah, on an individual level, it almost seems like you have to be a little bit off. And maybe that just allows you to be more open in a way. Maybe it's not just a one-to-one correlation where it changes something in your brain, but just being more open and not seeing the world as everybody else does, like Kanye West. He's like, fuck it, I'm going to make what I make because it feels right to me. And I'm not being put into this box that we're all supposed to work from, but I'm going to look outside of that box. And that's essentially what a neurodivergent person is walking against the crowd of people walking toward them and seeing things differently.
Yeah, but it also, like, even beyond the people who are just geniuses, we've done serious psychological studies. We've accessed all these things where psychologists can study across huge populations, how people process things and think of things to get an idea of all the things in our brains that do tie us together. Mm-hmm. But I still always say this because it is true. I've only ever lived between my two ears. And everyone else out there, if they think about it, well, that's the truth too.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's like, what are these small, microscopic things that could be just a little different, even if it's 0.1% in each of us, that make the whole, that in and of itself kind of hides the secret of what this consciousness is all about. You understand what I'm saying?
I do, yeah. I completely agree. And what would be the purpose if we were all the same and we all did the same thing and we all thought the same thing? It takes that polarity in order to do that, good, bad, positive, negative, whatever we want to call it. But okay, so let's say hypothetically we are here because we are different iterations of source consciousness sent here to learn in order to contribute to the evolution of said consciousness. So the universe can learn about itself,
Yeah.
essentially. This came up recently in a conversation with my wife too, is and kind of harkening back to what we were talking about, is maybe there's things we just can't understand. Not because we, don't ever think about it, we don't ask the right questions, we just can't. A big thing for me is, what is this relationship between this physical existence, which I think is secondary. I think it's an emergent phenomenon that grows out of primary consciousness. And I'm in this body, that's all I have too, is how I perceive things that go in my eyes, that I touch and feel and can think about, limited by the time and space that I exist in, even outside of this body. But when this body exists, this thing I call Michael P. Masters, with his stupid three names. But this is my only frame of reference, but it's the frame of reference that I am a part of that can, help in all of these different ways. But the thing that came up with my wife is, it's like, what would be the fucking point of knowing everything that exists in the land of remembering before we walk across the river of forgetting? What's the point? We wouldn't be here if we had access to that. We wouldn't walk across the river of forgetting if it didn't serve some purpose. So, yeah, to your question of how is it all linked together, I think we all have to forget, as we come into these bodies seeking knowledge, seeking information, seeking unity with each other, but realizing that we're all coming from a different viewpoint. We see the stimulus different. We see the catalyst differently, but we're still one, all giving back to the same thing. And that's not my idea. That's not an original idea. That's just from looking at all of these different things associated with what we're talking about, with consciousness and the universe. And God, there's so many near-death experiences, psychedelic experiences. It all just seems to sort of indicate that they're all the same, and they're just different parts of something much bigger. Yeah.
Yeah. You mentioned in your book some of the different theories on what things are. You mentioned things, we've talked about some of them obviously today, but obviously Extra-Tempestrals, extraterrestrials, multiverse, simulation, spiritual. One of the places I wanted to start with was the multiverse, because to me it ties into what you're saying, but it seems like you were separating the two. When you're talking about future humans, the concept there is obviously that they can traverse time, and they can, if we're experiencing them, as some people claim they are, then they can come here and they've solved for that.
Mm-hmm.
I've always thought of the multiverse, and this is just me, as kind of tied to that too, because the multiverse just means that there are all these different versions of this same reality that exist in different dimensions. But in order to travel across dimensions, you could essentially be traveling across time. What I mean by that is, as Michio Kaku says, like, if he had a radio, he's like, if you move the transistor just a little bit this way, then in this room there would be dinosaurs.
Yeah.
Right? But we're here in 2024. So they're different times, but the same place. You see what I'm saying? So how do you distinguish those two theories specifically from each other and make them their own separate buckets?
Yeah, that's a great question. And your Michio Kaku impression is spot on, by the way. That's quite good. I kind of thought he was in the room with us for a second there.
He's an easy one.
That's an interesting question, because I think there's a lot of layers to that we can peel back on this proverbial onion. So yeah, in looking at theories about this, there's this theory. I don't claim ownership of it. This time-traveling future human theory has been around as early as the 1940s, as far as I can tell. And early in my second book, I tried to acknowledge everyone I could find through a massive literature review who has talked about this in some capacity. There's also the interdimensional idea, which has been battered around too. Batted around? It might be batted around. by Jacques Vallée and John Keel with the ultra-terrestrial model. Like there's some overlap innately because we're talking about something that exists sort of outside of time, space, time,
That's right.
not just extraterrestrial. So a lot of these theories, even the crypto-terrestrial model, is about an advanced civilization sequestering itself in or around Earth, far side of the moon, underwater, wherever, but their origins are still up for grabs. And in this paper we just published in June about scientific openness to this crypto-terrestrial idea, we list possible origin points of them. They could be from outer space with more advanced technology, coming here, building a base on the far side of the moon. They could be from time. They could be future humans that don't want to just constantly go back and forth through time, that set up in our time, especially if they're harvesting gametes, sperm and egg. It's easier to do that if you just have a ship that's built here that doesn't have to be a time machine. And I think this giant triangular craft that's seen on occasion and was part of the Phoenix Lights, perhaps, I referred to it as a floating fertility facility in my second book, because seemingly this is where a lot of that was happening on a mass scale. I was bringing in males and females and taking sperm and egg as this gamete harvesting process. So, but again, that doesn't necessarily, just saying crypto-terrestrial, that doesn't answer the question. It doesn't say where they're from or when they're from. Same with the interdimensional idea. What this extra-tempestral model is, to answer your question specifically, is a model about future humans coming back in their own timeline, in the block universe specifically. So they're coming back
in the block
universe. And that's an important distinction. It has elements of interdimensional, has elements of the multiverse, like you were saying.
Yes.
And in that situation, you're right. They could be jumping across timelines. This timeline happens to be just a little less evolved as far as the rate of evolution as it happens in these different timelines. So therefore, they would be from the future of people in this timeline and likely have other aspects of their existence just because of the differences in that universe that they come from. But with regard to this block universe, it is one of few things, or at least I guess I should say one of few things that physicists agree on is that we don't know what time is. Like how I was saying that this physical universe feels like something that's emergent from a fundamental consciousness, source consciousness universe, infinite reality. Most physicists agree that time is an emergent property of something more fundamental. And it's likely that it really isn't anything in that infinite consciousness, that all moments are now. And I hear this all the time.
All moments are now.
Yeah. So, and intuitively, they feel like that. That's all we experience is now. Yeah. But at the same time, we can't know what now is. I remember being on a plane in college, early in my college years, and I kept trying to find now. I'd be like, okay, that woman's walking down the aisle when she gets there. That's going to be now. But they're inseparable from any other now. And Einstein, was very, very perplexed by this question of the now. What is it? How do we quantify it? We can't. But seemingly outside of these bodies, and I think we almost have to make a separation between the metaphysical aspects of time and the physical aspects of time. Where we in these bodies, as organisms that interact with each other and that eat each other, had to have a sense of time in order to avoid getting eaten, or to capture something you want to eat, or to find a mate, or to do a mating display of some sort to get laid in the first place. We had to have a sense of linear, progressive, unidirectional time. So we've evolved that in these physical bodies as an aspect of existence. But outside of that, you hear over and over with near-death experiences, out-of-body experience, psychedelic experiences, abduction experiences, where time moves differently, almost like it doesn't even exist. People that die for a brief period of time have access to move their consciousness, their awareness, just around instantly, and at any time. They can move forward and backward in time. So I think... long way around this. I apologize.
No, it's great.
This one's coming back, though. I feel like a couple went in a direction, but this one, I am circling back. It's a long-ass circle, my friend, but I am getting there.
That's the beauty of long-form podcasts. You're allowed to do this.
That's true. So what I'm saying is I think it's the same thing if we look at the way the universe works, is that in the block universe, just to backtrack on that for a second, It's the idea that all moments from the birth of this universe, from the Big Bang, all the way till when the last bit of matter goes into the last black hole and cycles back to source and cycles back to the beginning of a new universe that may be the same one. All those moments exist as a massive four-dimensional block of space-time. Everything is in there. So when you move in the block universe, say I'm going back to 10 years ago, I'm going back, I'm walking around, I'm petting cats, I'm pushing old ladies down in the street, I'm picking flowers. All of these things that I do don't change anything. They're just things I was always going to do in those moments. So when I get back, everything's the same. Because all those moments are structured that way. As I see linear time, as I grow and change throughout my life, I go back and do that thing, but those moments are already there. I was already pushing down that lady and picking flowers. When I get back, nothing's changed. And that's the block universe, and that's what I structured this extra-tempestral model around, recognizing that there's also the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. There's also the multiverse, which is related to that in some capacity. So there are other theories where there can be change. Where I go back, I push that lady down. She was supposed to be the head of the UN, and now everybody's fighting each other in wars. You know, she broke her hip and couldn't become head of the UN because I guess that could happen somehow. So there could be change in branching timelines with different universes that grow out of that. And a lot of these physicists would argue that even by going into the past, just showing up there, it causes quantum decoherence and a separation of timelines.
It's an estuary.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're taking the question out of my mouth here, but I was going to bring up the Michikaku point. He always points out, and like obviously everything we're talking about is theoretical.
You got to do it in the voice, though, man.
I'll do it in the voice. But this makes all the sense in the world to me because it explains like the butterfly effect of life. But he's like, if you went back in time to April 14th, 1865, and shot Abraham Lincoln, you are not changing the Abraham Lincoln that is dead in your timeline, or if you stopped him from shooting Abraham Lincoln. Just because he is alive does not mean he is alive in your timeline. He is alive in a new timeline, a estuary, a river off this river.
Exactly.
And I think that, like, that's what you're saying, it sounds like. And I don't see a scenario where you could go back and, like, let's use your example, push over the lady who's like the UN whatever, and she breaks her hip. That can change everything. So, like, suddenly you may do that and you may disappear because now you don't exist. You would have never been born.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the grandfather paradox. Consistency paradoxes in general only matter if you can change the past. But in the block universe, you can't. There is no change. Everything is self-consistent, and it's in line with what's called the Novikov self-consistency principle. You know, Igor Novikov developed this, and it's very widely appreciated. Worked with Kip Thorne and Klinkhammer and all these physicists in the 1970s. He wrote a book called The River of Time too. Speaking of estuaries and rivers,
Look at that.
and yeah, there's a circle. It's all coming. It's all coming together. But in this book, he still looks at it in the context of the block universe, this one river. But you can paddle upstream. You can fish in these other parts of these backwaters that are upstream, but you're not changing anything because there's an inherently self-consistent series of events that will take place. So again, you can do anything you want. You come back, everything's the same because you went back and just did the things that you were always going to do and had done already in those moments that pre-exist you even being alive, perhaps. But as you see it as one massive block of all events, or even just one timeline, and again, that's where I mostly drew from for this extra-tempestral model, because it is the most conventionally held understanding of time in physics. And all I can do was work with what we know now. Like, I don't have some insight into the future that I'm bringing back and putting in these books. I'm just working from what we can know now. And because the block universe is most conventionally understood and makes the most sense, I think, with regard to this model, there's others who would argue, this the same dude, I heard this dude on a podcast recently. I won't say his name because I don't like how people beef in these things.
Start a rap beef in UFOs. Let's go.
We definitely need more of that in the UFO community, don't we? But this dude was like saying how I say NHI all the time, and I just throw it around and then say they're future humans. But I'm like, bro, I've literally never done that. Read a book.
Oh, he was calling you out.
Yeah, he was calling me out specifically.
Oh, shit.
And he's also cited my research in one of his books, and then is like, well, this all makes sense and I like it, but we can change the past, and that is a point that I will acknowledge. Like, don't say false things about me, but I will acknowledge and have acknowledged that there are other ways, because we don't understand what time is. It's possible that it is somewhat malleable. The block universe, even though it feels right for a lot of this, it maybe isn't right for all of it. There might be other ways in which the universe is structured, but is somewhat malleable within that. And I was talking to a guy in Denver about this just a month or two ago. And we kind of came to this weird consensus that it almost feels like there's checkpoints. Like, there's all of these different ways that things can happen and do happen, where we have agency and free will, but there's some sort of checkpoint that you go through that sort of funnels those down, and then we sort of branch out from there again, and there's agency, and there's the ability to, live your life and feel like you're making decisions, and you do, but then we still come through another checkpoint, like
do you have an example of what that would be? Like a checkpoint?
So we were talking about individual aspects of our lives and how he sort of felt like he was on this path. He's a very successful person, written books. He was one of the co-authors of The Phenomenon with James Fox. And so what we were discussing is sort of his trajectory and how it felt in his life, where he had an experience early on. I don't know how much he's talked about this publicly, so I don't want to say things. But he had an experience early on, and it sort of guided a lot of his life, much like mine has in similar capacity. But there were times when he sort of veered from that path, and there were catalysts that brought him back. And he feels like he always had agency and the will to choose, but he always kept kind of coming back to something when it needed to happen. And I guess that's where this checkpoint idea came from. It's a very loose metaphor.
Yeah.
But I think, I don't know. And it's not because, I guess I'm trying to say that I don't think anything's black or white, and to say it's the block universe or the many world's interpretation of quantum mechanics, I don't feel like that's right. It's probably a gray area in between, but until we know what time is, it's impossible to know what that gray area looks like.
Yeah, you blow up my head when you start telling that story about being on the plane and being like, that's now. No, that's now. Because the only way we understand reality is based on what we've been told it is. And the people who told us came before us, and they figured out less than we did as a society. Like, once you start thinking of it that way, this gets weird very quickly.
That's a good observation.
But like, I also think about this all the time. I find myself wondering about it a little bit and how it would play into the, I don't know, creationism aspect of our Earth here. But you've talked a little bit about simulation theory and all that. Is there a way that simulation theory could tie into extra-tempestral theory and coexist?
Absolutely. Yeah, and I mentioned it specifically in that book where I was looking at other explanations for this phenomenon, because when it was initially proposed by Nick Bostrom, I think is his name, and then Rizwan Vert kind of took it and made it more approachable by adding the video game analogy and RPGs, NPCs.
Rizwan's going to be coming in here.
Yeah, he's good people too. I think you'll enjoy that conversation. I've got to hang out with him and talk about these same types of things, but he acknowledges too, and Nick Bostrom did initially, that these may be ancestral simulations. So what that implies is that it is future humans doing simulations about their past that we may be experiencing.
Oh, whoa. So
future humans,
us.
Future humans is inherent in that. If they're doing, millions of simulations or billions, I don't know how many they could do, it might be us in the future doing these to see what different iterations of the past may have existed. So I think it's inherent in that in a way. I think the crypto-terrestrial hypothesis could also play in with this. I'm not saying, what I've come to think is that there is no one theory that's right. I think they're all kind of right in different ways. ultra-terrestrial, crypto-terrestrial, simulation, interdimensional, multiverse, future human, and the block universe. I'm kind of starting to get the sense that they're all kind of different interpretations of the same thing, and we're reaching a nexus point where we're starting to have the capacity to see the picture in a broad enough way that we can make sense of how, and then also NDEs, out of body experiences, psychedelic experiences, the beings that people meet in DMT trips, mescaline, ayahuasca. I really get the sense they're all connected. Religion too, in the way that we've interpreted, but also have developed our worldview, our religious worldview, out of experiences. I kind of am starting to think it's all the same damn thing.
And it's almost like they're simulated to connect together.
Doesn't it feel like that
Right?
sometimes?
Yeah, when there's just things you can't explain in the universe, why this happened and then that happened. You know, there's a lot of things that could cause that, but I see a lot of patterns in my head all the time. It's just how my brain thinks, and like when I see those patterns happen in completely diametrically opposed directions, it's like, I hope I said that right.
And
it's wild.
And I struggle with the simulation idea, just because it seems limiting. But
What do you mean limiting?
Well, I think a lot of it's just a limit to our lexicon. We don't have the words necessary to articulate the broader complexity of these situations. So simulation is a good starting point, but kind of going back to what we were talking about before with the different iterations of our consciousness and these different bodies that have these different experiences, like when we come here, when we're put here, and when we choose to come here and do this video game, to follow that analogy, we have a sense of what we'll be doing and what catalysts will help us grow and to contribute to our own spiritual growth, the growth of ego, the growth of our soul, and the collective whole. It feels like a fucking simulation, It feels like that because it's not the real. There's something more that's real. And if you die for a little bit, or you take one too many hits of acid, you also get a glimpse of that. So that there's something else, this deeper reality, this deeper pool that we're swimming in, that we get glimpses of from time to time. But this thing that we're in, simulation, I don't feel is the right word, but it might be one of the closest words we have for it.
Yeah. Do you, based on all the work you've done and things that you've considered, do you think there's like a God? Do you think there's something on top of all of it?
If you would have asked me that even 3 years ago, it would have been a very different answer. Partly because of the trauma of my childhood and what God was and the God that was forced upon me.
Right.
The nounified God, based on you and Danny Sheehan's conversation. A God that was used, a God whose name was taken in vain to be used to do horrific things, that continues to be used to do horrific things. People have a mouthful of scripture and a heart full of hate in many ways. But I was only focused on the interpretation of the God, the Son, the Holy Spirit that came through people, and I saw rampant hypocrisy in it. So I grew up in the church. I grew up in a pretty conservative Church of Christ type of environment. But for me, early on, I noticed a difference in what was being said and what was being done. Like we can tell our kids whatever we want. They're not going to learn. They don't give a shit. But they do learn from our actions, and they model their behaviors and their response to catalysts and their response to different stimuli based on what we do. And I saw early on, I remember, I don't know, I was probably 10, 11. I was probably 11 years old. And we skipped church because my dad needed help cutting firewood and stacking it before winter came. I was like, wait, we're supposed to be in church. He needs my free labor. So free labor is more important than church. Okay, so maybe church isn't that important. And this was all around the time that he left us for the babysitter. And I'm like, wait a minute, there's something ain't right here. So I started asking questions.
Oh, wait, he left
for
the babysitter?
Yeah, started a new family.
Oh.
Took off with the babysitter. I mean, she was hot, so I get it. But No, as an adult, I can look back on that and be like, oh, she was a smoke show. So, yeah, I'll give him a pass on it.
I love you writing off childhood trauma. She was hot.
Yeah.
You're like, would.
Well, I wouldn't now, seeing the effects of it on other people. But
yeah, fuck the effects. She was hot.
As a man in a man's body, who does appreciate women.
I'll make sure Mrs. Masters doesn't listen to this one. Don't worry.
No, it's fine. She knows. She would probably think she was hot too. But yeah, and appreciates, all aspects of adulthood, I should say. I appreciate things now that I couldn't have then.
Sure.
But I saw the hypocrisy, and I continue to see the hypocrisy. People that have, the people that are the loudest about Jesus tend to act the least like Jesus, from what I've seen. And that's a broad generalization.
Yeah.
I'm not saying everybody's like that. I all of my family, with the exception of a few, are still very religious. There's different kinds of religion. There's different levels of hypocrisy. I'm not trying to paint with a broad brush here. I'm just saying that my personal experience, what I saw and what I continue to see, is a lot of rampant, sort of almost institutionalized hypocrisy.
I think if I would clarify it from my own opinion, I would say that is true for the people who are seeking in any way to use religion as a source of some sort of power.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right.
Using
I
God in vain.
I think a lot of people who are very religious, from my experience, use it for the right things, because they don't come in here and fucking bother me about it, or tell me you need to submit and do this. But those people,
the loud ones,
they're
the loud ones are full of shit.
Yes,
and it's almost like it's compensating for something. It's always the ones that are the preachers that are so against pedophilia, they get busted for pedophilia, or that homosexuality is a sin, but they're smoking cock in the bathroom at a rest stop. But we just keep letting that happen and don't call them on that bullshit, and it pisses me off.
Yeah.
So anyway, I have a long, somewhat jaded history with the way I view religion and the way I still do. But to answer your question in a long roundabout, probably heretical kind of way, is that I do believe there is an infinite creator. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what a lot of these people also think. We share that in common. But the way we go about it, in all the different religions, all the different ways that we see the spirits and everything, animism, polytheism, monotheism, and all the different ways we've conceptualized and honored and embraced and cherished the universe, manifests in many different ways. Yes. But I think it's all seeking the same path back to that infinite creator. So yes, I do believe in that type of source energy, infinite knowledge, infinite energy, infinite light, infinite love. But I don't really know what to make of it outside of that. I think Chian's right. Like we can't nounify it, and when we do, it causes a lot of problems.
I just try to live my life humble in what I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the thing that makes me really curious about this space and looking at, are there aliens or the future humans and stuff, is that the idea that there could be layers between me and whoever the creator is, I'm totally open to that. Because, look how big the fucking galaxy is. Yeah. You don't think that that's possible? I certainly think it is. But they don't have to be mutually exclusive.
No, not at all.
And when I talk to guys, that was one thing with Lou Elizondo, people pick apart a lot of different things he says. But when I asked him about that, and you could, Alessia, you were sitting here too. When I asked him if he, through everything he's done, does he believe in God at this point? This whole, just the blood, went from his face in a beautiful way. And he was like, oh my God, yes. And he's like, it has actually strengthened my belief in that. It's just, I don't want to put words in his mouth or try to repeat exactly what he said. That was right at the end of that episode. It was the last 5 minutes or so. People want to check that out, 237. But you could see that he just understood there was way more to it than he had previously known just in his life before.
And did he say that was tied to this seeking in the UFO realm at all? Were they related?
Well, if what you mean by that is, does he think that the UFOs are spiritual? Or?
No. Just so what I'm saying is I'm kind of tying it into what we were talking about earlier, how the UFO in a physical sense may be a pathway to the metaphysical. into a seeking of understanding what lies beyond that. And that's what happened to me. Like, you take my highly jaded, just really unpleasant experience with organized religion, but UFOs still brought me back there. I never thought I would be back here.
Interesting.
I'm just asking if he said anything, not that I expect you to get into his mind and know everything he thinks, but if in that conversation there was some sort of pathway there, like it exists for me.
I think it's different.
Yeah.
And I don't want to put words in his mouth. What I'll say is the words he did use were that it was strengthened through this.
Yeah.
Like his faith in that it all has to start with something.
Right.
Right. And the peace that he had with that. This is a guy who I don't think has peace with a lot of things that he has to talk about for reasons people can guess or, bet on at home. But like when it came to that, pure peace with it. And,
yeah,
I do think that as someone who's never seen any of this stuff or been read in on any of this stuff or things like that, I can only imagine how you might react if something were confirmed to be not of this present 2024 or whatever, but if you can do that without it ripping apart everything you already thought to be true, which is like ontological shock.
Yeah, for sure.
If you could experience that knowledge without that happening, I would imagine there has to be some form of like Zen that comes with that. And I can only imagine that, but that's how it comes across to me.
Yeah,
I'll tell you
same.
that.
Yeah, absolutely the same. And I think, in these conversations I've been having with my psychiatrist lately, I don't think we're supposed to talk about stuff like this. I don't know. I've never had a psychiatrist until recently, but
Well, I think you're allowed to talk about what you do in there, right? It's just the psychiatrist can't talk about it.
No, I just mean as far as social stigma. Like
Oh,
even
no.
saying
Oh,
that I have
yeah,
a psychiatrist
no,
seems
there's
like,
no
but
stigma.
I guess everybody does these days
Yeah.
because we all need one because society's fucked. But in these conversations, it was interesting to see how she dealt with a lot of this stuff that I'm telling her because I don't know what her background is, and a lot of it's arguably quite weird. But it's been amazing the types of questions she's asked and how much it's helped me grow in my understanding. A lot of that is related to, I've found through these conversations, a new appreciation for the spiritual aspects of our existence, which I was a strict materialist, reductionist, imperialist.
Trying to fuck around and take over a
Yeah,
nation?
I took over Australia for a while. I still feel bad about it. Actually, my ancestors might have. Who knows in a past life. Empiricist maybe was the word I was looking for there.
We'll
You
go
get the
with it.
point.
Yeah.
You get the point. And anyway, in any case, this was all just so outside. And actually what's interesting about your question about how my wife took it is she was always the one that had a deeper understanding of energy and chakras and just different aspects of our metaphysical existence that I had sort of, I didn't write them off, but I wasn't compelling to me. I wasn't that interested in it. And now, I feel like I've sort of evolved into her in a way. And a lot of other people have been further down this path. And I probably sound like a noob talking about this stuff, but to me, it is sort of at the root of a lot of it, or at least it feels more important or equally important to these questions of what are these craft in a physical sense? How do they work? How do they have anti-gravity propulsion systems? How do they manipulate time and space? And there's a lot of indications they do. But a lot of that I feel is kind of, a gateway to a different way of seeking and understanding, even if we can't really fully understand it.
What do your colleagues make of all the work you do? Like, let's start with anthropology specifically. Like, it's not like all anthropologists are working on future humans or aliens or things like that. Like, what kind of, what's the feedback there?
Yeah, it's pretty, a lot of just ignoring, kind of waiting and seeing, I think. My colleagues who know me and know my research ethic and my research program are supportive even. Like, oh, this is cool. There's a guy published a number of papers with in respectable journals, Frontiers in Neuroanatomy, Journal of Anatomy, and really prominent researcher in Spain. And I just sent him a book on a whim. I bought it on Amazon Spain and sent it to him just because I wanted to know, like, what did he think about all of this? And he actually, in a publicity announcement for a new journal article I had coming out, he even referenced future humans as part of the public announcement, like a little homage to the book that I wrote. So, and then he sent it to me. He's like, "Hey, I read your book. I think this is really interesting. And look what I did. I did a funny, like
Mucho gusto, senor."
Yeah, he put a funny little thing in there. It's like, because it was about if we could go back and take MRI scans of Neanderthal, because he does a lot of paleo neuroanatomy, and all we have is the wrinkles and the endocast, so we can see the shape of the brain and we can see parts of its anatomy, but it's just the hardened rock inside. We don't have the brain itself. So obviously, if we could go back and put a Neanderthal in a functional MRI scanner, we could get more information. So he made a little joke in there. That's one example. A lot of them just kind of ignore it. Not really a lot of outward criticism, because I did write my first book for my colleagues. And that's why it's called Dense, because I needed it to make a case that was understandable and scientific and fastidious in all of the arguments, because that's who I'm writing it for. I wanted everybody to be able to read it, so I made it readable. And I had it peer reviewed by a professor who taught quantum mechanics, thermodynamics, another PhD in biological anthropology, PhD in biology. So I wanted to make sure the science was there, but then I also had beta readers who could be like, "Okay, this is confusing as shit. Can you please rephrase this?" It's hard. It's really hard to find that middle ground, but I feel like the book did a decent job. I recommend the audiobooks, because then you can just hear it. You don't have to stop and like look up the word, but I define the things. I try to make it more understandable in the speed, the cadence, and how I explain things, which is what I have to do for a living as a professor. We want things to be understandable to our students. So I think the audiobook does that without making it feel like a slog, because for people without a science background, it can, but my academic colleagues read it and they say, this makes sense, And as far as my institutional colleagues, it's been great. They asked me to teach an honors class about my first book. The chancellor of the entire university shook my hand in 2019 and said, "Hey, I saw an article in Fox News about your book. Congratulations." I got a research and scholarship award from the dean's office right before I went on sabbatical in 2022. And at that point, 90% of my research was about this UFO question. So yeah, I feel supported, and I feel like people understand it and respect it, but there's still a lot of just, let's kind of sit back, let's wait and see what everybody else decides before we attack them or praise them, and that's kind of funny. And I think I mentioned off camera earlier that there's also a difference across fields, like physicists.
Yeah, you're talking about other scientists.
Yeah, physicists, there's more of them involved at different universities outwardly. Psychologists hate this shit, especially the abduction phenomenon. I'm serious. Like,
I'm
it's
not
so weird.
surprised.
It's like you study people and their mindset and their mentality. You'd think they'd be the most interested, but no, they're like, we know the brain. We know psycho behavior. Everything else is bullshit.
Yeah,
So
that's
get
why
out of
it
here
does-
with
that's
that
why it doesn't
UFO
surprise
talk.
me.
I know, it's crazy. And there's obviously exceptions, there's outliers, but as far as fields and the perception of this from these various disciplines, it's a mixed bag. It's really kind of interesting how some are galvanized and some are just like, no, get out of here with that.
You were saying like cosmologists are totally against it.
Generally, that's what I found. I don't know.
Why is that
And maybe
versus
I'm just,
physicists?
maybe I'm taking Neil deGrasse Tyson and applying that unfairly to other cosmologists. But personally, what I think it is they don't have any idea what they're doing because they don't know what time is. They also, many think that space is an emergent phenomenon. So if you're trying to explain the origins of the cosmos and how everything works, but you don't know what time and space are, you're kind of just doing it with your pants down,
Yep.
So I think maybe it's an overcompensation of a lot of their root founding principles being based in something that they don't yet understand, and then trying to overcompensate and say, well, we understand everything, and actually you're wrong, and UFOs don't exist. That's just my own personal feeling on it. I don't see why any one group would be so staunchly opposed to something, but I don't know. There's a lot of variation out there.
I think a big part of it, I know you were saying some of this wears off, but I think a big part of it is the is the long-term weaponization of stigma that has not worn off.
Yeah, true.
These people who have 6 degrees and have been studying something for 20, 30, 40, 50 years don't care if CBS airs a 5-minute interview about UFOs. They don't care if Congress, who they view as very dumb people, are having a hearing about it. You know, not to say those things aren't noteworthy. They are. It's just like, and I feel like you would understand this better than I do because you know a lot more of these people than I do. But from the outside, like having spoken with some sitting in the seat that you sit in right now, like they're on the smart ones in those fields are on a different wavelength. And I think sometimes that can work against them a little bit.
Yeah, and something we face in any field is that you get attached to an idea.
Yes.
And you can't you can't say you were wrong, you know? Or you can't say, well, wait, what if? Because you got to double down.
Yeah.
You know, we see this all the time with naming a new hominin species. It's like, well, I said it was this. Yeah.
I don't see this. You see this.
Right. Good point. Good point. Within my field,
Yes.
we within my field see this all the time. And it changed. Recently, this guy named Lee Berger challenged the whole system with this rising star cave find of Homo naledi. You probably heard about this 5 or 6 years ago. It was all over the news.
Homo naledi?
Yeah.
Nalidi?
EDI, I think.
EDI.
Naledi.
Can we pull that up? Homo naledi?
But it was this really interesting find. It looked really primitive, so initially I thought it was really old, but then there's some aspects that are what we call mosaic evolution, where there's some indications that it didn't all evolve at the same time, but different parts evolve faster and slower. I think with this one, the hands were more primitive, but there's certain elements of its postcranial morphology that were more advanced. So the whole thing that had been done, it's the good old white boys of paleoanthropology would take all of these fossils, hide them in their lab, study them for 10 years, and then publish in Nature or Science. That's how it was done. Everyone's expected to do that. He finds these fossils. It's really hard to get to area, going down like tiny people. He had to hire tiny paleoanthropologists to even get down there to get these things out and to study them. But he did it differently. He had a group of people come in, research them fast, and publish in open access journals. Everybody's like, well, what the hell are you doing? That's not how we do it. You know, but it's important because we sometimes have to challenge those things in order to get information that can be broadly disseminated. And there's a lot of pushback. They did other things too. They were talking about whether they buried their dead, did they have fire, were they making petroglyphs on the walls. So there were other controversial things too. But I think it's important to always challenge those things in your field. I'm saying this as an example that I think can be put out more broadly, because you don't always do it right. Just because that's the way people did it before you doesn't mean it's the best way to do it. And I think we're seeing that within a lot of individual specializations in various different fields, that this question of UFOs makes you reassess what you were doing, how you were doing it. And some people just aren't willing to even say, yes, that could be a thing, because now I have to do all the work of figuring out how it fits with the way I think about stuff and the way my field does things.
Right.
And that is changing, though. We see it changing, and I think it's good, and it's going to have to be that way. We're not at a point where we can all be Neil deGrasse Tyson and say, nope, that's wrong, because I know everything about the universe. Rather, we have to say, we don't know shit about the universe. That thing is clear proof that that's true. So let's acknowledge the reality of that and figure out what we don't know.
And also the people who have the most attention, for better or worse, depending on the context of the situation, their opinions are going to ring more, right? No. And so Neil, I disagree with him on how he looks at that. He's allowed to have that opinion, though.
Super smart guy. Yeah, super accomplished. I'm not trying to bash him individually, but that mentality is harmful, I think.
Yeah, when it then extrapolates across a lot of people. I do think the good thing about that one in the forum of open opinions that we now live in the world is that when he said this opinion plenty of times before, but when it really got attention was when he was on with Joe Rogan, who has the opposite opinion. And Joe Rogan, in my opinion, gave a better case than he did in response to that. So people at home, you know, it's not like Neil deGrasse Tyson is telling you, you have to think exactly like I think. He's saying, I really think this, thinks it strongly. The other guy comes back and says something different. Okay, great. Decide for yourself at home. You know, and I'm with you that you don't want to shoo off stuff, but there are going to be people who, with the right intentions, you know, maybe have an opinion that ends up being wrong, or that we don't like, and that's like I had Lawrence Krauss in here. Lawrence has some very different opinions than I do on the nature of the universe and everything. But the guy, he's a ball breaker. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah.
He's a smart motherfucker.
Yeah, he is a smart motherfucker. And I like, he's a ball breaker. He says what he thinks, and nobody knows. Nobody knows really anything with regard to the nuances of these questions.
That's right.
And all we can do is ask them. And I think, that format for debating things, like speaking of Rogan, he had like Flint Dibble and Graham Hancock on. Like that's healthy. Let's do more of that. Let's present in a broad format, a broad reaching format like that conversation where people can present ideas and let others decide, or at least in the dispute, we gain knowledge and move the needle further. So I think that is healthy. But you do have people this has come up a few times in our conversation today where they just turn off.
They do.
They're like, nope, not real.
You know what? I saw a quote from Keanu Reeves. I don't know if this is one of those fake quotes that's attributed to him, so maybe we can look this up. But he's like, I'm paraphrasing. He's like, I've reached a point in my life where it's not worth it for me to argue with people. If you tell me 2 + 2 = 5, sounds great. Have an awesome day, bro.
Yeah.
Like, God bless you.
Yeah.
And
it's sad.
That rings in my head a lot.
I know, and it's sad because it almost is the opposite of what we need to be doing. But I think it's also what we need to do as individuals to realize it doesn't matter. There's certain people that it just doesn't matter. You're not going to educate them.
You're not going
to change their way of thinking.
I'm not and I don't say this to be smug or arrogant or anything like that. But I'm not interested in people like that.
Yeah.
Right? Like if you are just going to be completely closed-minded on stuff and tell me how it is, this might be a bad thing to say, but like a lot of the time it's someone that, maybe they have a few less brain cells too. And that's not always the case. I've seen plenty of people who are brainwashed, but it's like, it's just not worth my time, man.
Yeah. I mean, and it's hard because, there is an inherent sense of elitism or smugness when we say these things, but it also is in the context of us protecting our own psyche because we realize that there's just no point.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's hard, especially as an educator, because you want to educate everyone, but my job's only to educate them in a classroom about things that I spent my life learning about.
Right.
Outside of that, I can apply those things, and I do on a regular basis. There's a lot of aspects of this phenomenon that overlap with what I have researched and taught about my entire academic career. But I think what we're talking about and what Keanu Reeves likely was talking about is just having a conversation with people that aren't willing to open their aperture. They're not willing to open their minds. They have a sense of reality. That's it. I don't care what anybody says. And so, obviously, inherently, you're not a very intelligent person if you're not willing to open your mind to other ways of thinking or doing or understanding. It's the Dunning-Kruger effect. The people that know the most, feel like they know the least. People that know the least feel like they know the most, and they're very loud about it. So I feel the same way. I just wanted to add that qualifier because it does innately sound a little, high and mighty, soapboxy. But we all know the people we're talking about. And I don't think we can even say it's one group or one demographic or one belief system, one political group. It's just people that have closed their minds down to this one little tiny bit.
I still think it's a minority of people, though. That's the thing. I
think so,
I
too,
think we are more exposed to it because people have a power behind a keyboard to put that out there, and they're incentivized to be more extreme.
They're very loud.
Right? And so when you walk outside, stick your finger up in the air and feel the wind, it's not like that out there. And when I have conversations with people every day, people are they're much more open, and I think that's healthier. So hopefully that can win out. But Michael, we got to do a quick Patreon episode on
I love Patreon.
some of the cases that you covered in your book and also some of the work you're going to be doing. But for now, we're going to have the links to your books down in the description, as well as any other links you want to pump in there. You let us know, and we'll put
I could think of forgetting one that I was trying to mention earlier, but if I can't even remember it now, maybe there's no point in sticking
All
it in
right.
there. It might have
Well-
just been something that popped up in conversation that isn't super relevant anyway. But yeah,
When you think of it later, send it to us and
will.
we'll stick it in there, 100%.
Perfect.
But thank you so much for doing this. This was
dude,
awesome.
this has been so fun. Thank you for having me. It's been an awesome conversation. Appreciate it.
Of course, love your work, man. It's really fascinating stuff.
Thanks. It's been fun.
Everybody else, you know what it is. Give it a thought. Get back to me. Peace. Thank you guys for watching the episode. Before you leave, please be sure to hit that subscribe button and smash that like button on the video. It's a huge help. And also, if you're over on Instagram, be sure to follow the show at Julian Dorey Podcast, or also on my personal page at Julian D. Dorey. Both links are in the description below. Finally, if you'd like to catch up on our latest episodes, use the Julian Dorey Podcast playlist link in the description below. Thank you.